Sergeant Dale Morrow did not simply walk away. He punctuated his departure with a cruelty that was as calculated as a firing solution. He drove the heavy, mud-slicked sole of his combat boot into Emily Carter's wounded side, a deliberate and precise strike designed to test the structural integrity of a human being he had already decided to discard. It wasn't a panicked kick or a clumsy stumble in the dark. It was the movement of a man checking to see if a piece of equipment was broken enough to justify throwing it into the tall grass. Emily's world narrowed to a single, white-hot point of agony that obliterated the sound of the rain and the wind. She screamed, a raw, jagged sound that was swallowed almost instantly by the vastness of the Montana wilderness. Morrow didn't flinch. He crouched down, his knees popping in the quiet intervals between the thunderclaps, and grabbed a fistful of her dark hair. He yanked her head back, forcing her face upward into the freezing downpour until her eyes were forced to meet his. His gaze was the most terrifying thing Emily had ever seen. There was no hatred there, no flickering spark of malice or even the heat of anger. His eyes were empty and calm, the flat, gray eyes of a man who had already processed his actions and found them entirely reasonable. He looked at her not as a soldier or a subordinate, but as a mathematical error that needed to be corrected. "You're a liability now," he said, his voice barely raised above a whisper yet cutting through the storm with chilling clarity. "And liabilities get left." He released her skull, letting her head drop back into the freezing mud with the same indifference one might show when dropping a stone into a well. Around them, 12 other soldiers stood like ghosts in the periphery of the storm. They were men and women Emily had trained with, eaten with, and bled with. Not one of them moved to help her. Not one of them spoke a word of protest or even looked at her for more than a fleeting, guilt-ridden second. They were a collective unit, and at that moment, the unit had decided she was no longer a part of the whole. They simply turned as one, a silent phalanx of shadows, and walked into the absolute dark of the mountain forest. The rain had been falling for 3 relentless hours before Sergeant Dale Morrow reached the conclusion that Emily Carter's life was an acceptable price for his own convenience. It wasn't a decision born from high-level strategy or the cold, hard necessity of a mission on the brink of failure. It wasn't even born from the kind of hardened military calculation that training is supposed to sharpen within a leader. It was born from something much older, much uglier, and far more common. It was the kind of cowardice that meticulously wraps itself in the heavy language of pragmatism, so the man committing the act never has to look at the blood on his hands. Morrow had convinced himself he was being a leader by being a monster. Emily Carter was only 18 years old. She had been shot exactly 17 minutes ago, a stray round from a brief, chaotic skirmish that had left her leaking life onto the forest floor. The sergeant who was sworn to bring her home had just walked away, leaving her to be reclaimed by the earth. She didn't scream after them as their silhouettes faded into the trees. She didn't have the breath for it, and she certainly didn't have the inclination to beg. The bullet had caught her just below the right rib cage, a high-velocity intrusion that had clipped something vital and internal. Every time her lungs expanded, ribbons of liquid fire spiraled through her torso, radiating outward toward her spine and her hips. She lay there in the shallow gully, the mud beginning to pool around her tactical vest, and stared up at the sky. She knew enough field medicine to understand the gravity of her situation. This wasn't an immediately fatal wound. She wasn't going to bleed out in seconds. But she also knew that the distance between not immediately fatal and survivable was a chasm wide enough to swallow a person whole. She was in shock. Her body's internal temperature was dropping, and she was alone in a quadrant of the Montana highlands that was currently crawling with hostile elements. Lightning strobed across the heavy, bruised clouds, illuminating the world in brief, terrifying flashes of violet and white. She started to count. 1001, 1002, 1003. The thunder rolled in from the east, a low, continuous growl that mimicked the sound of distant artillery. It was the kind of sound that made your marrow vibrate, a reminder that the world was much larger and much more indifferent than any one human life. She pressed her palm harder against the wound, feeling the warm, slick reality of her own blood. "Okay," she said. Her voice was a fragile thing, smaller than she intended, rough and hollowed out by the cold. "Okay, Emily. Think." The first thing she did was perform a mental audit. She didn't let herself focus on the betrayal or the crushing weight of the silence left behind by her unit. Those emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford, a secondary infection that would kill her faster than the bullet if she let them take root. She took stock of her physical reality instead. Her right side was a disaster zone, compromised and screaming. Her left arm was functional, though her fingers were beginning to go numb. Both of her legs responded when she willed them to twitch. She could move, but movement was a currency, and she was already dangerously close to bankruptcy. Staying in the open gully was a death sentence. An enemy unit was operating somewhere in these mountains, and the rain was washing away any tracks she might have left. But it was also washing her heat and her will into the soil. She needed cover. She needed to stop the bleeding. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the immediate, visceral terror of the moment, she needed to process the fact that the man she had trusted with her life had looked her in the eye and decided she was worth nothing. But that realization was for later. For now, there was only the crawl. There was a granite overhang approximately 30 meters away. She had noted it on the way in, her mind automatically cataloging the terrain features of the gully as they passed through it. It was a habit born of a year of intensive training, a mental mapping of every environment she entered. It was a shallow shelf of rock, jutting out about 4 feet from the base of a steep hillside. It was low enough that she would have to press herself flat against the cold stone to fit under it, but it offered 2 things she desperately needed: protection from direct fire and a reprieve from the rain that was currently trying to wash her away. 30 meters. In a normal world, it was a distance she could cover in seconds. In this world, it took her 11 minutes of agonizing, soul-crushing effort. She dragged herself forward using only her left arm and her heels, her right side screaming in protest with every inch of progress. By the time she finally pulled herself under the shadow of the rock and rolled onto her back, her vision was starting to betray her. A brightening, shimmering narrowness was creeping in from the edges of her sight, the unmistakable signature of grade Roman II shock. Name, she asked herself aloud. Her instructors had hammered it into her. Verbalization is an anchor. It keeps the brain from drifting away into the gray. Emily Rose Carter, she whispered, her teeth beginning to chatter. Serial number 774 Echo Charlie. Born August 12th. Current location. She paused, her mind working through the fog of pain to calculate her coordinates. Montana Highlands, northeastern quadrant of grid reference November Mike 77. Elevation approximately 6,400 feet. The sound of her own voice, however frail, seemed to steady her. She reached for her tactical vest with fingers that felt like wooden stakes. To her surprise, the first aid kit was still there, secured to her side. Morrow's people hadn't even bothered to strip her of her gear. It was a final insult, a sign that they were in such a hurry to abandon her that they didn't even care about the equipment she carried. Or perhaps they simply assumed she would be dead before she could ever use a single bandage. She was going to make them very, very wrong about that. The field dressing was a heavy, specialized pad designed for high-velocity abdominal wounds. She knew the protocol by heart. Pack the wound, apply pressure, and maintain the seal. She bit down hard on the sleeve of her jacket, the fabric tasting of salt and old rain, and began the work. The pain spiked into a white-hot roar that threatened to tear her consciousness away, but she pushed through it, her movements mechanical and precise. When the dressing was finally secured, she lay perfectly still for 60 seconds, forcing her lungs into a slow, deliberate rhythm she had been taught during her first month of training. 4 counts in, she whispered the words a rhythmic mantra. 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Her instructor's name had been Sergeant Patricia Odom. Everyone called her Pat. Pat had been the first person in Emily's military career who hadn't looked at her 18-year-old frame and seen a child playing at war. Emily had arrived at the Mountain Reconnaissance Training Center with nothing but a single duffel bag, a topographic memory that bordered on the supernatural, and a stubbornness so deep it was practically pathological. Pat had looked at her and said, "You're going to be exhausting, Carter. I'm going to love that." Emily thought about Pat now, huddled under the freezing rock, and for the first time since the bullet had struck her, she felt a flicker of something other than pain. She felt a spark of defiance. She listened to the rain, trying to find a rhythm in the chaos of the storm, and then she heard it. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic revelation. It didn't sound like a movie soundtrack shifting into a minor key. It began more like the persistent ringing in her ears that had started when her blood pressure began its downward slide. But as she lay there, focusing on her breathing, the noise shifted. It moved from the white noise of shock into something that had distinct shape, weight, and direction. She heard footsteps. They weren't nearby. Her rational mind told her they had to be at least half a mile away, maybe more, moving through a parallel gully that ran east to west about 300 meters north of her current position. There were two sets of feet. She could distinguish them with a clarity that defied logic. One was heavier, moving with the practiced, even rhythm of a trained soldier on patrol. The other was lighter and more erratic, the footfalls of someone who was fatigued, nervous, or perhaps both. Emily went completely still, her heart hammering against the granite. She had always been known for having good hearing. Her bunkmate, a woman named Kim Torres, had once called it genuinely unsettling, and her training sergeants had referred to it as a gift. But this was different. This was hearing at a level of granularity that was impossible. She wasn't just hearing the presence of people. She was perceiving the weight distribution of their steps. She could hear that the heavier man favored his left side slightly, perhaps carrying a heavier pack or nursing an old injury. She could hear the specific, dry scrape of nylon webbing shifting against ceramic body armor. Beneath the roar of the wind, she even thought she heard the faint electronic chirp of a radio being keyed twice, the universal signal for being in position. She pressed herself flatter against the rock, her mind racing to process the data. They were moving through the north gully in the same direction her unit had retreated, but they weren't following the retreat. They were moving in parallel. This meant they knew the route Morrow was taking. They were positioning themselves to cut them off or flank them at a predetermined killing ground. Miller's Crossing. The name surfaced in her mind with the cold, crystalline clarity of a sudden realization. Miller's Crossing was a narrow, aging bridge over a deep gorge, the only viable point for heavy equipment or a retreating unit to cross in this entire quadrant. If you wanted to move a force west, you had to go over that bridge. And if you wanted to destroy a force moving west, you simply had to wait for them to arrive. Emily had tried to warn them. 3 days ago, she had submitted a written intelligence summary to Lieutenant Hargrove. She had noted unusual radio traffic in the grid squares to their north, traffic that used a specific frequency hopping pattern she had been tracking for months. She had used the phrase possible prepared ambush site and requested a simple aerial reconnaissance of the approach to Miller's Crossing. Hargrove had looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite dismissive, but it carried that particular tilt of the headmen sometimes used when they thought a woman was being overeager. He told her she was reading too much into signal noise. He'd called her assessment charming but disproportionate to her experience level. She hadn't pushed back. She had written it in her personal log and moved on, trusting the chain of command. Now, she was bleeding under a rock while the very ambush she had predicted was closing its jaws. The unit that had left her to die was walking straight into a slaughterhouse. She needed her radio. It was the only thought that mattered now. Her personal comm unit had taken a direct hit during the skirmish. The same round that had pierced her side had likely passed through the radio casing first. It was silent, its screen shattered, a smear of her own blood obscuring the dials. But Emily knew the anatomy of her gear. The transmission module in these units was a separate shielded component, a design redundancy intended for exactly this scenario, where a unit could be partially destroyed but still maintain a shred of functionality. She pulled the radio from its pouch, her hands shaking so violently she had to pin the device against her chest to keep from dropping it. The casing was cracked, a clean hole punched through the upper right side. The main circuit board was almost certainly toast, but the lower housing, where the module and the power cell lived, looked intact. She almost laughed, though she knew the effort would send fresh waves of agony through her ribs. She was going to make this work. She reached into her vest and pulled out a small multi-tool from her left breast pocket. It was a gift from Pat Odom, given to her on the day she graduated reconnaissance training. Pat had told her to always keep a tool somewhere that wasn't her primary equipment. Primary equipment gets lost, she'd said. Primary equipment gets shot. Your heart doesn't. Thanks, Pat, Emily whispered into the dark. The repair was a nightmare. She had to work by touch and the intermittent flashes of lightning, her fingers slick with blood and rain. She spent 47 minutes bypass wiring the transmission module directly to the remaining power cell, building a makeshift pathway out of thin copper wires she had painstakingly stripped with the multi-tool's pliers. She counted her breathing intervals to keep track of the time, 187 intervals of 4 counts each. Finally, she heard it, the faint, beautiful hiss of static. A carrier signal. It wouldn't last. The power cell was damaged and draining rapidly. She estimated she had maybe 2 or 3 minutes of transmission time before the whole thing died forever. She had to make every syllable count, but before she keyed the mic, she listened one more time. The hearing was still there, sharper than ever. The 2 scouts in the North Gully were gone, but they had been replaced by something much larger. She could hear the rhythmic, heavy movement of a full assault element approaching from the east. Not 2 people, but 12, maybe 15. They were moving with a terrifying efficiency, closing the distance to the crossing. She could hear the low, mechanical drone of something heavy being moved. A tripod-mounted weapon, likely a heavy machine gun or an anti-tank missile system. It needed a stable platform, which meant they were heading for the ridge spur that overlooked the western end of the bridge. She keyed the transmitter. "Base, this is Carter, Emily, 774 Echo Charlie. I am injured and isolated. Grid reference November Mike 77. I have intel on a hostile assault element. Please respond." Static filled her ears for a long, agonizing moment. She began to fear she had wasted her last reserves on a ghost signal. Then a voice broke through. "Carter, this is Sergeant Major Willis. You're supposed to be dead, kid." She recognized the voice instantly. Arthur Willis, base operations. He was a man who lived by the book and respected anyone else who did the same. "I'm working on it, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice cracking. "But I don't have much time. Miller's Crossing is a trap. I am tracking an assault element of 15 hostiles moving through the eastern approach. They are using the frequency hopping protocol I documented 3 months ago, file reference 7 Charlie Foxtrot. They are moving to a pre-established position. If 1st Platoon is moving west, they are walking into a killing zone." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make her heart stutter. "Carter, how are you tracking hostile movements? Morrow's report said you were down and out of contact." "I can hear them," she said. She knew how insane it sounded. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, I can hear them. They have scouts linking up with the main element 800 meters east of the crossing. They are staging now." "How long until 1st Platoon reaches the bridge?" Another pause. In the background of the transmission, she could hear the sudden explosion of activity at the base. Voices shouting, the frantic clatter of keyboards, the sound of an operations center shifting into high gear. "Estimated 20 minutes, Willis said, his voice now devoid of doubt. He had decided to trust her. It was a shift she felt in her very bones. 20 minutes is enough, she told him. She talked for the next 90 seconds, pouring every detail she had gathered into the radio. She described the approach vectors, the likely firing positions, and the specific ridge spur where the heavy weapon would be placed. She gave Willis the interlocking fields of fire and the exact sequence 1st Platoon would need to follow to neutralize the threat before it began. She was giving them a map to survival, drawn from the sounds of the mountain. "The enemy communication will shift to a direct channel in 4 minutes, she warned. "That's when they'll initiate. You need 1st Platoon to reverse course and establish a defensive perimeter immediately. If they do it right, they'll catch the assault element in the open. If they keep moving forward, Sergeant Major, you're going to lose everyone." Willis's voice came back one last time, softer now. "Emily," she almost smiled at the sound of her name. "Do it," she said. "Trust what you're hearing. I've never given you bad intel." "No," he replied, "you haven't." The radio died with a final, pathetic spark of static. She set it down with trembling hands, giving the piece of junk a moment of silent respect. It had done its job. Now she was back in the silence, back in the dark, with nothing but the rain and the pain for company. Her body was fading, the cold finally starting to win the battle for her core temperature. She was exhausted in a way that defied description, not the tiredness of a long hike, but the systematic shutting down of a machine that had run out of fuel. But she kept listening. 3 minutes and 40 seconds after she cut the transmission, she heard the assault element stop. It was a sudden, jarring stillness. It was the sound of 15 people receiving new information and realizing their plan had just developed a leak. They were reassessing, they were hesitating, and then from the west she heard it. It was distant but unmistakable. The sound of 1st Platoon's engines and heavy gear shifting. They weren't moving toward the bridge anymore, they were reversing, they were repositioning. Willis had gotten through. Emily closed her eyes. In the darkness, she saw Dale Morrow's face again. She saw the efficiency of his betrayal. He hadn't left her because he hated her. He had left her because he didn't think she was worth the effort of saving. He had made a value judgment, a calculation of her worth, and he had found her lacking. She filed that image away in a very specific corner of her mind. She had been filing things away her whole life. The names of every street in her hometown, the frequency patterns of enemy radios, the way the light hit the mountains at dawn. Now she filed away the look in Morrow's eyes. The rain began to ease, the heavy downpour tapering off into a cold, persistent drizzle. The lightning was moving further east, the flashes becoming dim flickers on the horizon. She wondered if this new sense of hearing would stay with her, or if it was merely a byproduct of the trauma, a neurological fluke that would vanish once she was safe. She didn't know, but she knew she was alive. She knew she was stubborn, and she knew that the mountain was no longer her enemy. She pressed 2 fingers against her wrist, finding the pulse. It was thin, like a frayed wire, but it was there. Fast, steady, and persistent. She thought about Pat Odom telling her she was going to be exhausting. She thought about Hargrove and his dismissive tilt of the head. And she thought about the fact that she was an 18-year-old girl who had just saved an entire platoon from under a rock in the middle of a storm. The assault element in the east remained motionless, caught in the indecision of a compromised mission. First platoon was safe. Emily Carter, wounded and abandoned, pressed her back against the granite and listened to the world slowly rearrange itself. She had more work to do. She always did. She was already thinking about the next step, about the internal investigations, about the look on Morrow's face when she eventually walked back into the light, and about the specific mathematical certainty that she was worth more than he could ever imagine. She breathed in for 4, held for 4, and let it out for 4. She was still here. And as long as she was still here, the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The stillness of the mountain was deceptive. To anyone else, the night would have seemed empty, a void of shadow and wet stone, but to Emily it was a crowded room. She could hear the moisture soaking into the lichen on the rocks above her. She could hear the way the wind changed pitch as it whistled through the jagged teeth of the ridge. But most importantly, she could hear the enemy. They were frustrated. She could hear the subtle, jagged edge of their movements now, no longer the smooth, confident advance of a predator, but the jagged, reactive shifts of a group that realized the roles had been reversed. They were talking, not over the radios. They were too disciplined for that, but in low, guttural whispers that carried through the damp air like vibrations through a wire. They were debating whether to push forward or melt back into the timber. Emily lay there, a silent witness to their confusion, feeling a cold sense of triumph that was better than any painkiller. She had stripped them of their greatest weapon, the element of surprise. Her own body felt heavy, as if she were being slowly pressed into the earth by an invisible hand. The cold was no longer a sharp bite. It was a dull, pervasive ache that made her bones feel like they were made of lead. She knew the signs. She was sliding toward the edge of unconsciousness, and if she went over that edge now, she might never climb back out. "Stay awake, Emily," she whispered. The sound of her own name felt like a lifeline. Stay awake for Pat. Stay awake for Willis. Stay awake to see Morrow's face. She began to play a game with herself to keep the darkness at bay. She started cataloging the sounds of the forest, assigning them to categories. The steady drip, drip, drip of water from the overhang was a percussion instrument. The rustle of the pine needles was the string section. The distant, angry murmur of the river at the bottom of the gorge was the brass. She conducted the symphony in her head, focusing on the minutiae to keep her brain from shutting down. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The assault element in the east finally made their choice. She heard the sound of their retreat, a careful, muted withdrawal that most people wouldn't have noticed. They were moving back toward the higher elevations, abandoning the ambush site. They knew the window had closed. A few minutes later, she heard something else, a new sound. It wasn't the heavy, synchronized movement of a platoon or the stealthy tread of scouts. It was the rhythmic, thumping beat of rotors. A medevac chopper, flying low and fast, hugging the contours of the terrain to avoid detection. Willis had sent the cavalry. The sound of the helicopter was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. It grew louder, a deep, resonant thrumming that shook the very rock she was leaning against. She watched the sky, waiting for the searchlight to pierce the gloom. When it finally came, a brilliant, blue-white beam of light sweeping across the gully, she didn't close her eyes. She stared into the light, letting it burn away the shadows of the night. She was found 40 minutes later. The search team moved with a frantic energy, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. When the first medic reached her, a man with wide, panicked eyes and hands that smelled of latex and antiseptic, she didn't say a word. She simply pointed to the dead radio at her side. He looked at the wound, then at the radio, and finally at her face. "Jesus, kid," he whispered. "How are you even breathing?" Emily looked past him toward the horizon where the first hint of gray was starting to bleed into the sky. "I was listening," she said, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "I was just listening." As they lifted her onto the stretcher, the pain flared one last time. a blinding white explosion that finally carried her into the dark. But it was a different kind of dark now. Not the cold, empty void Morrow had left her in, but a soft, quiet place where she could finally rest. She knew that when she woke up, the world would be different. There would be questions, there would be reports, there would be a reckoning for the men who had walked away. But as the helicopter rose into the morning mist, Emily Carter felt a strange, quiet peace. She had survived the mountain, she had survived the bullet, and she had survived the betrayal. She had proven that she was not a liability. She was the one who heard the truth when everyone else was deaf. And that was a power that no one, not even Dale Morrow, could ever take away from her. The flight back to the base was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic hissing of an oxygen mask. She caught glimpses of the medics working on her, their faces grim, their movements a choreographed dance of emergency medicine. She felt the prick of needles and the cooling sensation of Roman IV fluids, but she remained anchored by the sound of the rotors. They were a constant, a steady heartbeat that reminded her she was still in the world of the living. By the time they reached the surgical unit, the sun was fully above the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the tarmac. Emily was wheeled through a maze of sterile corridors, the smell of ozone and floor wax replacing the scent of wet pine and blood. She saw Sergeant Major Willis standing by the doors, his face a mask of iron-gray concern. He didn't say anything as she passed, but he placed a hand on the edge of her gurney for a split second, a silent acknowledgement of the debt they owed her. The surgery took 4 hours. They removed the bullet, repaired the damage to her liver and ribs, and stabilized her blood pressure. When she finally drifted back into consciousness, she was in a small, quiet room flooded with the soft light of late afternoon. She wasn't alone. Pat Odom was sitting in a chair by the window, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked exactly the same as she had a year ago, sharp, observant, and entirely unimpressed by the drama of the situation. "You look like hell, Carter," Pat said, her voice a warm rasp in the quiet room. Emily tried to smile, but her face felt stiff. "I feel like hell," she whispered. "I heard about the radio," Pat continued, leaning forward. "Willis told me the whole thing. Bypassing the circuit board with copper wire. That's some desperate, beautiful work, Emily. You're lucky I taught you how to use that multi-tool." "I kept it in my left pocket," Emily said, her voice growing stronger, "just like you told me." Pat nodded, a small, rare smile touching her lips. "You did, and you saved a lot of people who didn't deserve it. Morrow is already under guard. Hargrove, too. There's an investigation starting that's going to peel this whole unit apart like an onion." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the news. She thought about the 12 soldiers who had walked away. She thought about the silence in the gully. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I'm still here." "That you are," Pat said. "And you're going to be a problem for a lot of people for a very long time." Emily Carter lay back against the pillows, listening to the hum of the hospital and the distant sound of a bird outside the window. Her hearing was still sharp, perhaps not the supernatural clarity she had experienced in the storm, but better than it had been before. She could hear the nurses talking at the station down the hall, the sound of a car starting in the parking lot, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a broken piece of equipment. She was a survivor, a witness, and a soldier. And as the sun began to set over the Montana highlands, Emily Carter finally let herself sleep, knowing that the mountain had finished its work, and so had she. The following weeks were a whirlwind of recovery and interrogation. Every day, men in suits or high-ranking officers in crisp uniforms would come to her bedside, wanting to hear her story. They asked about the shots fired, about the specific words Morrow had used, and most of all, they asked about the hearing. They wanted to understand how an 18-year-old girl with a hole in her side could track an enemy element with better accuracy than their most advanced sensors. Emily told them the truth, though she could tell many of them didn't believe her. She told them about the weight distribution of the scouts, the nylon webbing, and the frequency-hopping patterns. She told them how the mountain had become a map of sound. Morrow's defense was predictable. He claimed he had made a tactical decision based on the information he had at the time. He claimed he thought she was already dead, that staying to recover a corpse would have endangered the entire unit. But Willis had the recordings. He had the log of Emily's transmission, the one she had sent from a radio that shouldn't have worked, from a girl who shouldn't have been alive. The trial was brief. Morrow was stripped of his rank and sent to a military prison, his career ending in the same disgrace he had tried to inflict on Emily. Hargrove was reassigned to a desk job in a remote outpost, his reputation permanently tarnished by his failure to listen to the intel that could have prevented the whole mess. As for Emily, her recovery was slow but steady. The physical wounds healed, leaving behind a jagged scar on her side that she wore like a badge of honor. The psychological wounds were deeper, but she had Pat Odom to help her navigate them. They spent hours walking the trails near the base, Emily regaining her strength while Pat taught her how to manage the sensory input that still sometimes overwhelmed her. "You're different now, Emily," Pat told her one evening as they watched the stars come out over the peaks. "You've seen the worst the world has to offer and you didn't let it break you. That makes you dangerous." "I don't want to be dangerous," Emily said. "I just want to be useful." Pat laughed. "In this world, kid, being useful is the most dangerous thing you can be." Eventually, Emily returned to duty. She wasn't the same girl who had arrived at the training center with a single duffel bag. She was something more, a specialist in reconnaissance and signal intelligence, a woman whose name was whispered with respect in the halls of base operations. She never forgot the gully, or the rain, or the sound of the boot, but she didn't let them define her. She became a teacher eventually, passing on the lessons she had learned to the next generation of soldiers. She taught them about topographic memory and field medicine, about the importance of redundancy and the value of a good multi-tool. But most of all, she taught them how to listen. She taught them that the world is always talking to you if you're brave enough to hear what it's saying. And every time it rained, she would stand by the window and close her eyes, listening to the rhythm of the water against the glass. She would remember the cold, the pain, and the silence. And then she would remember the sound of the rotors, the light of the searchlight, and the feeling of finally being found. She was Emily Carter, and she was still alive. That was the only victory that ever really mattered. The rain had tapered off to a persistent, ghostly drizzle that clung to the trees like a shroud. But in the eastern approach, the air felt thick with something far more oppressive than moisture. Emily lay pressed against the jagged shelf of granite, her cheek resting on the cold, mossy stone, listening to a silence that wasn't silent at all. It was the quality of the stillness that troubled her. It wasn't the patient, predatory quiet of a hunter waiting for a target to emerge. It was the stillness of recalculation. She could almost feel the gears grinding in the dark, the unseen players shifting their pieces across a board she could only partially see. Something had changed in their picture. The variables had shifted, and she was the only one left in the mud to solve for X. She didn't know yet whether it was Willis moving fast enough to spoil their timing, or if it was something else entirely, some shadow factor she hadn't accounted for in her logs. She hated not knowing. In her world, information was the only currency that didn't devalue when the shooting started. She cataloged the uncertainty, tucked it into a mental folder, and forced herself to keep breathing. Each breath was a slow, deliberate victory against the cold. The rain eased another degree, the rhythm of the drops on the leaves slowing to a sporadic tap, and then, cutting through the damp air, she heard the voice. It came from the North Gully. It wasn't one of the two scouts she'd been tracking earlier. They were further west, closer to the main body of the assault element. This voice was new. It was low and flat, speaking in the clipped, staccato phrases of encrypted radio protocol. Even through the distance and the interference of the terrain, Emily recognized the cadence. She couldn't parse the specific words. The encryption was too thick for the naked ear, but the rhythm was all wrong. It wasn't the rhythmic flow of a foreign language, nor was it the standard chatter of her own unit. It was a frequency that didn't match the equipment it was supposed to be coming from. It had an American cadence, an American rhythm. Her mind locked onto that detail with the tenacity of a predator. She'd heard that specific pattern before, but not in the field. It hadn't been in a foxhole or a command tent. It had been 8 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning that should have been entirely forgettable. She could see the room vividly now, a cramped briefing space with a flickering fluorescent light and a folding table that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. People had sat around, bored and restless, talking about operational security as if it were a chore rather than a lifeline. Emily had taken notes because she always took notes. She was the 18-year-old girl who never missed a comma, the one who saw the world in signal logs and frequency hops. After that meeting, she'd approached Lieutenant Hargrove. She had asked him about a specific radio protocol that had appeared in her logs, something that didn't fit the local theater's architecture. Hargrove hadn't even looked up from his clipboard. He told her the frequency didn't correspond to any known hostile asset in the region. He dismissed it as signal ghosting, a technical glitch in a high-latitude environment. The voice in the North Gully was using that exact frequency. Emily pressed herself harder against the granite, the cold stone biting into her skin, and did the arithmetic she didn't want to do. One compromised frequency, documented 3 months ago and dismissed by Hargrove. One prepared ambush at a position she'd flagged 3 days ago, also dismissed by Hargrove. One tactical retreat that had moved her unit precisely into the kill zone, ordered by Morrow. And finally, one 18-year-old intelligence specialist left in the mud with a bullet wound, abandoned at the exact moment her intelligence would have been most inconvenient for the people in charge. She thought about the word liability. She remembered the specific weight Morrow had put on that word before he turned his back on her. "You weren't leaving me because I was slowing you down," she whispered to the rain, the words barely a breath. "You were leaving me because I knew." The knowledge settled into her chest alongside the sharp, stabbing pain of her wound, and for a long moment she couldn't tell them apart. They were both heavy, both cold, and both potentially fatal. 32 minutes had passed since her radio had died. She knew this because she'd been counting the intervals, marking time by the rhythm of her own heart and the slow drip of water from the overhang. First platoon needed between 18 and 22 minutes to reverse course and establish defensive positions if they'd responded immediately to Willis's emergency order. She was well past that window now. Either the message had gotten through and the bridge was secure, or it hadn't, and the world was currently falling apart a few miles to the west. Either way, there was nothing more she could do about Miller's crossing from under a granite shelf. She was a ghost in the woods with one functioning sidearm and a wound that was costing her blood every time she dared to shift her weight. What she could do was stay awake. What she could do was keep listening. What she heard next made her stop breathing entirely for a full 4 seconds. A name. Her name. It was spoken by the voice in the North Gully, clear enough that the wind carried it across the half-mile distance with a clarity that defied the laws of physics. It arrived in her ears with the same terrifying precision that everything had possessed since the ringing in her head started. "Carter, the girl. Is she confirmed?" A second voice replied, closer this time. It was one of the scouts returning from the perimeter. Morrow said she'd bleed out before morning. The first voice came back, flatter and more careful than before. "Morrow says a lot of things." There was a pause, a heavy silence that felt like a death sentence. "Find her." Emily was moving before the sentence even finished. She wasn't running. Her body was physically incapable of producing a run at the moment. But she rolled sideways out from under the overhang in a controlled, fluid motion. The movement triggered a sharp, jagged intake of breath as a fresh pulse of heat radiated from the wound in her side, but she didn't let herself stop. She pressed her back against the right side of the overhang's base, where a protrusion of rock broke her silhouette against the dark. She went still. It was the kind of stillness that wasn't born of hesitation, but of a cold, hard decision. They were sending someone to confirm her death. That meant she wasn't just a casualty of war. She was a loose end. It meant every calculation she just made in the dark was correct, and being right was the most dangerous thing she'd done all night. She did a quick internal audit of her resources. No radio, a multi-tool, a field dressing that was currently saturated but holding. Half a protein bar she hadn't touched because the act of eating required energy she was desperately rationing. And a sidearm with 11 rounds in the magazine. 11 rounds, one shooter coming from the north. She could hear him already. It was the lighter of the 2 scouts, the nervous one she'd cataloged earlier. His footfalls had a particular erratic quality, the sound of someone trying to move quickly while simultaneously trying to be quiet and failing at both. He was moving south now, angling toward the southern gully, likely assuming she would have crawled toward the nearest cover. He was trying to be professional, trying to act like a hunter, but Emily could hear the fear beneath his movements. She understood fear. She was currently operating in its shadow, but she was using it as a compass rather than a weight. She timed his approach against the intervals of her own ragged breathing. Her mind drifted for a second to Pat Odom, back to a gray November morning on a training range in the middle of a desolate stretch of forest. Pat had been her mentor, the one who saw the steel beneath her quiet exterior. He taught her a lesson that had nothing to do with marksmanship or fieldcraft, but everything to do with survival. Reactive decisions, Pat had said, are when the situation controls you. Deliberate decisions are when you control the situation. Fear is reactive. Fear plus decision is deliberate. You're never going to get rid of the fear, Emily. What you're going to do is make decisions faster than it can stop you. Fear plus decision. She made hers. She was not going to fire. Not yet. 11 rounds was a finite resource, and in these mountains, a gunshot was a flare that would bring the entire main element down on her position. She would lose whatever paper-thin margin of safety she still possessed. She was going to let him come close enough to see that the overhang was empty, and by the time he realized she was gone, she would be somewhere else. The problem was that somewhere else was a very limited set of options for a bleeding 18-year-old in a rainstorm. She chose the creek bed. It ran along the southern edge of the gully, a shallow trench that was mostly dry in the summer but was currently rushing with an inch of freezing, fast-moving runoff from the storm. It was 4 meters of open ground from her current position to the edge of the creek. In daylight, in full health, she could have crossed it in 2 seconds. In the dark, wounded and seeking tactical silence, it was going to take much longer. She moved. It took 8 seconds. Every inch felt like a mile of broken glass. She felt the wound pull, a sharp bark of protest from her nervous system that she acknowledged and then ignored. She pressed herself into the shallow creek bed, letting the ice-cold water wash over her right side. She didn't make a sound. The shock of the cold was actually a blessing. It acted as a crude anesthetic, numbing the white-hot ache in her hip. She noted this with a distant, academic part of her mind, the part that was still functioning like a computer even as the rest of her was fighting for air. The scout reached the overhang 40 seconds later. She heard him checking the space, his movements methodical but hurried. He was clearing the area with the efficiency of a trained soldier. Then the sounds changed. She heard him find the discarded packaging from her field dressing. She heard the faint metallic click of him moving the stripped wire she'd left behind when she tried to repair the radio. There was a specific, heavy silence that followed. The silence of a man looking at evidence and realizing his mission just got a lot more complicated. "She's mobile," the scout said into his radio. His voice was tight. The flat voice responded instantly. "Find her before she finds a way to talk to anyone else." She had a radio, the scout countered. "It's dead. The transmitter's burnt out. She tried to rebuild the casing, but it's a brick." The flat voice was quiet for a moment, and Emily could almost picture the man on the other end, calculating her worth. She's 18 and she rebuilt a destroyed radio in the dark while wounded. Don't underestimate what she can do with what she has. Find her. Emily lay in the freezing water and listened to a man she'd never met accurately assess her capabilities. It was a disorienting, chilling sensation, the feeling of being known by the wrong people. But the water was getting colder, and she knew she couldn't stay there. Hypothermia was just a slower version of a bullet. She calculated the scout's position. He was still at the overhang, roughly 30 meters to the north-northeast. She began to move upstream. Upstream meant east, and east meant distance from the main element. In her current state, distance was the only resource she could manufacture. She moved in 10-meter increments. Move, stop, listen, calibrate, move again. The scout was paralleling her, but he didn't know it yet. He was searching the ground south of the overhang, working a standard grid pattern that assumed a wounded person would seek the path of least resistance. Most people moved downhill when they were hurt. It was basic physics. The body wanted to stop fighting gravity when it was failing. Emily moved uphill. It cost her more than she could put into words. Every breath became a negotiation with her own lungs. The wound had graduated from a sharp burn to a deep, insistent throb that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She managed the pain by simply refusing to acknowledge it as hers. She treated it like a data point, a flickering light on a dashboard that she had to keep an eye on but couldn't afford to fix yet. Uphill meant the ridge, and the ridge meant a line of sight over the eastern approach. If Willis had successfully moved 1st Platoon into defensive positions, the assault element would be forced to abort. They wouldn't throw themselves into a meat grinder if the element of surprise was gone. If they aborted, they would withdraw, and their withdrawal route was the final piece of the puzzle she didn't have. She had their staging area. She had their vector, but she didn't know where they went when things went wrong. It took her 19 minutes to reach the ridge, 19 minutes of crawling and bracing and listening to the mountain breathe. When she finally reached the crest, she pressed herself flat against the cold, wet earth and looked east. For the first time that night, she stopped relying on her ears and used her eyes. The assault element was withdrawing. She could see the movement in the valley below, dark figures pulling back in a disciplined, accelerated pattern. It was the rhythm of a unit that had received an abort order and was executing it with professional haste. She counted them, 12 figures. She counted them again to be sure. 12. They were moving northeast, following a draw that led back toward the high ground where they'd originally staged. At the rear of the column, one figure moved with a different pace than the others. He didn't run. Running was for people who hadn't prepared properly. He moved with a flat, measured stride, his shoulders squared, an absolute absence of urgency radiating from him. Even from this distance, Emily recognized the walk. It was the same walk she'd seen in a briefing room 8 weeks ago. She didn't know his name, but she knew his cadence. She knew his radio frequency. And she knew that he had just ordered her to be found and killed with the same clinical detachment one might use to order a part for a vehicle. He'd known about her. He'd assessed her as a specific problem that needed a specific resolution. That realization hit her harder than the wound. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a tragedy of errors. It was a plan. She pressed her face against the cold rock and focused on her breathing. She thought about the intelligence file she'd been building for 6 months. The signal logs, the cross-referenced frequencies, the pattern analysis that Hargrove had dismissed as signal noise 3 separate times. That file was sitting in her personal log, encrypted and backed up to a server she accessed through a backdoor she'd built herself. She'd learned early on that personal logs were only personal if you controlled the access points. Pat Odom had taught her that too. Trust your unit, he'd said, and back everything up somewhere your unit can't reach. Not because you don't trust them, but because you're 18 years old in a world full of people who have had more time to make worse decisions than you have. At the time, she'd thought he was being cynical. Now, she realized he was the only one who had been telling her the truth. Down in the valley, the figure at the rear of the column stopped. He turned, looking back toward the ridge. Even at this distance, Emily felt the quality of his attention shift. It was the way a person's body language changes when they are scanning a space, looking for a shape that shouldn't be there. He was looking at the ridgeline, looking at the exact place where someone with her training would go to gain elevation. She held her breath, becoming as still as the granite beneath her. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. She became a part of the mountain. He looked for a long, agonizing moment. Then he turned back to the column and continued his measured walk into the darkness. Emily let out a breath she'd been holding for so long it felt like a physical weight leaving her body. She had 12 names to put to 12 faces, even if she only had one face clearly etched in her mind. She had a frequency, a pattern, and a signal log that spanned 4 years. And she had a wound that was going to start making decisions for her if she didn't get medical attention within the next few hours. She also had the memory of Sergeant Major Willis's voice on the radio, calling her name in the tone of a man who was finally ready to listen. That memory was worth more to her than any protein bar or thermal blanket. She began the descent. The scout to the south was still searching, his movements becoming more frantic and less professional as the minutes ticked by. He'd clearly decided that stealth was less important than coverage, and he was crashing through the brush with the frustrated energy of someone who'd expected an easy kill and found a ghost instead. Emily tracked his noise, using it as a landmark to avoid. She came down the western face of the ridge, giving herself a 40-meter margin of safety that she maintained with agonizing care. At the base of the ridge, she found a flat-topped rock and sat down for a moment to perform a full physical audit. Wound, holding for now. The field dressing was soaked through, but the inner packing was still in place. She was losing blood, but the rate hadn't accelerated. She estimated she had 3 or 4 hours before the blood loss became catastrophic. 3 hours was workable. 3 hours was a mission window. Temperature, cold. The creek had done its damage. She was shivering, a low-frequency vibration that started in her core and radiated outward. Her jacket was a sodden weight, but her tactical vest was providing some small measure of thermal insulation. She could manage the cold. Cold was just more data. It told her exactly where her physical limits were. Mental state. She paused on this one. She was angry. It was a cold, clarifying anger that moved through her like a second pulse. It wasn't the kind of anger that wanted to scream or lash out. It was the kind that wanted to document. It wanted to stand in a room full of the men who had decided she was a liability and make them look at the math. Morrow had left her to die. Hargrove had buried her work for months, and some nameless man with an American accent had ordered her execution. In the space between those betrayals, she had rebuilt a radio, saved a bridge, and climbed a mountain on a bullet wound. She was so angry she could have used the heat of it to dry her clothes. Instead, she stood up. She found her bearings from the pale, gray light beginning to bleed into the eastern sky and started moving west. West was where Willis was. West was where the debriefing room sat waiting. West was where she would find the chain of command that was going to have to listen to every single word she had to say. She heard the scout one final time, far behind her. He was reporting back, his voice no longer frustrated, but quiet and careful. "I can't find her," he said. The flat voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Keep looking. She's not the kind to stop." Emily didn't know whether to feel threatened or respected by that. She settled for neither. She settled for focused. She moved through the thinning rain and the tentative pre-dawn light, counting her footsteps, listening to the mountain settle. She thought about the 12 figures in the valley. She thought about the weight of Morrow's boot against her ribs. And she made herself a quiet, solemn promise. Every single one of these things was going to matter. The smell of the base camp reached her before the sound did. It was a cocktail of scents she'd spent her life around: bitter coffee, the heavy sulfur of generator exhaust, and the unmistakable metallic tang of gun oil and wet canvas. In any other context, it would have been the smell of safety. Now it was just the smell of the next objective. Her body tried to relax, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, her pace wanting to quicken. She slapped those impulses down hard. Relaxation was a luxury she couldn't afford until she was behind a secure perimeter with a man she could trust. She'd been walking for 57 minutes since she left the ridge, a pace that was a desperate compromise between urgency and physical reality. Her left leg was screaming, having carried the weight of her entire body, while her right side remained a localized zone of agony. The outer perimeter sensor tripped when she was 60 meters out. She knew exactly where it was. She'd helped calibrate the sensitivity settings 6 weeks ago. She stopped walking, raised her hands. The movement sent a jagged bolt of pain through her side and spoke into the gray gloom. "Carter, Emily. 774 Echo Charlie. I'm coming in wounded. I need Sergeant Major Willis, now." The silence lasted for 4 heartbeats, then the sound of boots on gravel. 2 soldiers she recognized from the operations rotation, Specialist Roar and PFC Chen, materialized from the shadows. Their weapons were raised, but as the perimeter lights caught Emily's face, their expressions shifted from tactical readiness to pure, unadulterated shock. "Carter," Roar asked, his voice cracking. He looked at her like he was seeing a ghost, or perhaps just a very bloody hallucination. "I need Willis," Emily repeated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Now, before anything else." "You need a medic, Carter," Chen said, already reaching for the radio on her shoulder. "Look at your side, you're—" "Willis first," Emily interrupted, her tone sharp enough to stop Chen's hand in midair. "Please. What I have to tell him can't wait for a med bay. Tell him it's about Miller's Crossing and the frequency logs. He'll understand." Roar and Chen exchanged a look, the kind of look soldiers give each other when the world has stopped making sense. But Roar nodded and keyed his mic. Willis arrived in 4 minutes. Emily heard him coming, the heavy, rhythmic stride of a man who moved with a purpose that didn't care about the terrain. When he stepped into the light of the perimeter post, he stopped dead. For a split second, an expression flickered across his face that Emily had never seen there before, a raw, human flash of grief and relief that he suppressed so quickly she almost thought she'd imagined it. "You walked out," Willis said, his voice a low rumble. "I walked out," she confirmed, her legs finally beginning to give way. She leaned against a wooden support post, the rough grain biting into her shoulder. "Miller's Crossing held?" "It held," Willis said, stepping closer but keeping his distance as if he were afraid she might shatter if he touched her. First platoon established interlocking positions. The assault element didn't initiate. They withdrew at approximately 0412. "Northeast," Emily said. "They withdrew northeast up the draw toward the high ground. I watched them from the ridge." Willis went very still. The air around him seemed to thicken. "How do you know the direction of their withdrawal, Carter?" "Because I was there," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She lowered her hands, her strength finally failing. "Sergeant Major, I need to talk to you privately, before the debrief, before the medics, before a single word goes into a formal report. I need to tell you what I know, and I need you to listen to the math." Willis looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the blood, the mud, and the terrifying, cold intelligence still burning in her eyes. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He didn't tell her everything was going to be fine. He just nodded once, a sharp military gesture. "Roar, Chen," Willis commanded without looking away from Emily. "Secure this area, no one comes in or out. If Morrow or Hargrove shows up, you tell them I'm conducting a primary field debrief and they can wait in the TOC." "Sergeant Major?" Roar asked, hesitant. "Do it," Willis barked. He stepped forward then, offering Emily his arm. She took it, the strength of him the only thing keeping her upright. As they moved toward the small, darkened briefing tent near the edge of the perimeter, Emily felt the weight of the night finally beginning to settle. The rain had stopped. The sun was coming up, and she was still alive. Inside the tent, the air was stale and smelled of old canvas. Willis guided her to a folding chair and sat opposite her, his large frame casting a long shadow against the tent wall. He didn't turn on the main lights, opting instead for a small tactical lantern that cast a dim, red glow over the table between them. "Talk to me, Emily," he said softly. She took a breath, feeling the sharp pull of the wound, and began. She told him about the frequencies. She told him about the Tuesday morning briefing and Hargrove's dismissal. She told him about the American cadence on the radio in the North Gully and the 12 figures she'd counted from the ridge. She told him about the man at the rear of the column, the one who knew her name. As she spoke, the professional mask Willis wore began to crumble. He didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge her data. He sat there and watched her, his hands clenched into fists on the table as she laid out the architecture of a betrayal that went far deeper than a botched retreat. "They left me there because I'm the only one who keeps the logs," Emily said, her voice gaining a cold, hard edge. "I'm the only one who noticed the pattern. If I died in that gully, the pattern died with me. Hargrove knew that. Morrow knew that." Willis was silent for a long time after she finished. The only sound in the tent was the distant hum of the generators and the soft, rhythmic thud of a loose flap of canvas hitting a pole in the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a quiet, dangerous rage. "You're 18 years old, Carter," he said. "I'm 19 in 2 months, Sergeant Major," she corrected him automatically. He looked at her, a small, sad smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I forget that sometimes. You see things the rest of us miss. You're not a liability, Emily. You're the only reason we're still standing on this side of the bridge." He stood up then, his shadow stretching across the ceiling. "I'm going to get the medics in here, but they are my people, not Hargrove's. You stay quiet until I get back. Don't talk to anyone but me. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. She watched him walk out of the tent, her eyes tracking his movement with the same analytical precision she used for everything else. She was tired, so tired that her vision was starting to fray at the edges, but she didn't close her eyes. She couldn't, not yet. She sat in the red light and thought about the man in the valley. She thought about the way he'd looked at the ridge, searching for her. He was still out there, and he still had his 12 men, and he still had the frequency that didn't belong. But she had something he didn't expect her to have. She had the truth, and she had a sergeant major who was finally angry enough to do something about it. The flap of the tent moved, and a medic she knew, a quiet man named Miller, stepped in with a trauma kit. He didn't say a word, he just knelt beside her and started to work. Emily let him. She watched the way he cut away the sodden fabric of her jacket, the way he hissed through his teeth when he saw the state of the wound. She watched the blood on his gloves and the focused, clinical way he began to clean the site. It hurt. It hurt in a way that made the world turn gray and narrow, but she didn't make a sound. She just looked at the wall of the tent and waited. She waited for the sun to finish rising. She waited for the next move. Because the war wasn't just in the mountains anymore. It was in the camp. It was in the briefing rooms. It was in the very air they breathed. And Emily Carter, the 18-year-old girl who took too many notes, was the only one who knew how to win it. She felt the sting of a local anesthetic, the gradual numbing of the fire in her side. Miller was talking to her now, his voice a low, soothing murmur, but she wasn't really listening. She was thinking about her encrypted files. She was thinking about the backdoor she'd built into the server. She was thinking about the moment she would sit down in front of Lieutenant Hargrove and show him exactly what signal noise looked like when it was written in blood. The anger was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a pulse, it was a foundation. It was the thing she was going to build the rest of her life on. Outside, the camp was waking up. She could hear the shouts of NCOs, the rumble of trucks, the morning ritual of a unit that believed it had narrowly escaped a disaster. They didn't know that the disaster was still sitting in their midst, wearing a clean uniform and holding a clipboard. They didn't know that the girl in the tent was about to burn their world down. Emily leaned her head back against the pole, and finally, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let her eyes close. Just for a second. Just long enough to see the 12 figures in the valley one more time. "I'm still here," she thought. The thought wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact. A mathematical certainty. She was still here, she was still breathing, and she was no longer a ghost in the woods. She was a witness. And in the world she lived in, a witness was the most dangerous thing you could be. The medic finished the stitching and taped a fresh dressing over her side. He offered her a canteen and she drank, the water tasting like life itself. He told her she needed to sleep. He told her she was lucky to be alive. "I'm not lucky," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant in her own ears. "I'm just better at the math." Miller looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of a pity she didn't want and didn't need. He didn't understand. None of them did. They saw a wounded girl. They didn't see the weapon she'd become. Willis came back 10 minutes later. He looked tired, his face etched with the weight of the phone calls he'd just made and the ones he still had to make. He sat back down in the folding chair and looked at her. "It's done," he said. "The logs are secure. I've bypassed the local net and sent everything to Colonel Vance at Division. He's on his way here now. He'll be on the ground in 2 hours." Emily nodded. 2 hours. She could stay awake for 2 hours. "Hargrove?" she asked. "Confined to quarters," Willis said, and there was a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Marrow, too, pending a full investigation. They're claiming they thought you were dead, that the order to retreat was based on faulty intel." "It wasn't faulty," Emily said. "It was manufactured." "I know," Willis said. "The colonel knows, too, or he will soon." He reached out then and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. It wasn't the gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was the gesture of a soldier to a comrade. "You did good, Emily. You did more than anyone had a right to ask of you." She looked at him, and for a moment the wall she'd built around herself, the one made of data points and signal logs and cold, hard logic, cracked just a little. "They were going to kill me, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice small. "I know," he said, "but they didn't. And that's the part that's going to haunt them for the rest of their lives." He stood up and walked to the tent flap, looking out at the morning sun. The light was bright and harsh, cutting through the lingering mist of the rain. It was a new day, but the shadows were still there, hiding in the corners of the camp, waiting for the next turn of the wheel. Emily sat in the red light and watched him. She felt the weight of her sidearm in its holster, the sting of the stitches in her side, and the cold, hard clarity of her own mind. She wasn't the same person who had walked into those mountains. That girl was gone, left behind in the mud and the rain. The person who had walked out was something else entirely. She was a survivor. She was a soldier, and she was the girl who knew the frequency of betrayal. As the sound of a distant helicopter began to throb in the air, the colonel arriving to pick up the pieces, Emily Carter finally allowed herself to take a deep, shaky breath. The arithmetic was finished. The solution was clear, and for the first time in a long time, the world made perfect, terrifying sense. I need you to hear it without it going through the standard chain of command, because the standard chain of command is the problem. Emily's voice was a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper against the low hum of the base's generators, yet it carried a weight that seemed to anchor the air in the small, shadowed space. The silence that followed her statement was the kind that had its own physical presence, a heavy, pressurized stillness that pressed against the eardrums. Willis was not a man who made fast decisions. He was a man who made considered ones, which was a distinction Emily had learned to value above almost all others in the service. In her experience, a fast decision was often just a reaction disguised as leadership, but a considered decision was a commitment. She watched him carefully as the seconds stretched. She watched the way his eyes moved, taking in the reality of her condition. He looked at the jagged wound in her side, the dark stain of blood that had turned her shirt into a stiff, cold second skin. He looked at her face, which she knew was a mask of exhaustion and dried mud, and then at the filth that had worked its way into every fiber of her gear. She could feel the dampness of the mountains still clinging to her, the smell of rain and wet earth competing with the ozone of the communications equipment. Willis arrived at his decision the same way he'd arrived at the decision to act on her desperate, unauthorized radio transmission earlier that night. He did it by trusting the evidence of his own eyes over the expectations of his rank. "Chent," Willis said, his voice low and steady, never breaking eye contact with Emily. "Get Dr. Yates. Tell her to meet us in the secondary communications room. Tell her it's a field wound, stable for now, and that she should bring everything she needs and ask absolutely nothing until I give her the word." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "And Chent, you didn't see Carter come in? Not tonight, not ever." There was a beat of silence. Chent, a man who had survived long enough to know when the world was shifting under his feet, didn't blink. "Understood, Sergeant Major," he replied. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the corridor, his footsteps fading with a professional lack of sound. Willis looked back at Emily. "Can you walk another 100 meters? "I can walk a lot further than that," she said, and she meant it. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, buzzing focus that was far more dangerous. "You don't have to," he said. There was something in his voice then, not pity, which she would have hated, and not quite admiration, which she wasn't ready for. It was something quieter, a simple registration of her state that didn't diminish the person she was. "You just have to walk 100 meters. She walked. Each step was a calculated negotiation with her own nervous system. The secondary communications room was a cramped, utilitarian space, rarely used and tucked away in a corner of the facility that most personnel forgot existed. It was a backup fail-safe, a room designed to keep the base's pulse beating if the primary operations center ever went dark. It smelled of circuit boards, stagnant air, and the acidic ghost of old coffee, the particular staleness of a room that was meticulously maintained but never truly inhabited. Willis closed the door behind them with a soft, final click. He leaned his back against the heavy metal, crossing his arms over his chest. His face was arranged in that specific, neutral expression he wore when he was preparing to hear something that would require him to change the world. Emily didn't wait for an invitation. She sat down in the nearest chair because she knew that if she didn't, her body was going to make the decision for her, and she couldn't afford to collapse yet. She pressed her right palm against the dressing on her side, feeling the warmth of the blood through the fabric, confirming it was still holding. Then, she looked up at Willis and began to talk. She gave him everything in order. She didn't do it because protocol required it, but because order was the only way her mind knew how to process the chaos of the last 6 months. Precision was her primary weapon, and she wielded it now with the surgical focus of an analyst who knew her life depended on the data. She started with the frequency logs. 6 months ago, a signal had appeared, a ghost in the machine, a pattern that shouldn't have existed. She detailed the documentation she'd compiled, the way she had meticulously filed her findings with Lieutenant Hargrove, and the way he had dismissed them with a casual, almost practiced indifference. She moved through every subsequent sighting, every report she'd authored, and the identical wall of silence she'd hit every time she tried to escalate the issue. She covered the intelligence summary she'd filed just 3 days ago regarding the movement at Miller's Crossing. She described Hargrove's response in detail, the specific wording he'd used, the dismissive tone of his voice, the way he'd looked at her as if she were a child playing at being a soldier. Then she shifted to the gully. She didn't talk about the fear or the cold. She talked about sequence and timing. She described Sergeant Marrow's decision to leave her behind, recounting his exact words because emotion could be challenged, but a verbatim quote was a hard fact. "I heard a voice," she said, her voice tightening just a fraction. "From the North Gully, an American cadence. A specific phrase, phase 1 confirmed." She told him about the climb. She described hauling herself up the ridge on a bullet wound, the agonizing slow-motion struggle against gravity and pain, just to see where they were going. She told him about the 12 figures moving through the trees with a synchronized, professional grace. And then she told him about the 13th figure at the rear, the one who moved with the flat, chilling deliberation of a man who had prepared for every possible contingency and was only mildly inconvenienced to find that one of them hadn't gone exactly to plan. She told Willis she didn't have a name for that man yet, but she knew his shadow. Throughout the entire briefing, Willis hadn't interrupted her once. He'd shifted his weight twice, a subtle movement of his boots on the linoleum. He'd looked at the floor once briefly, and she'd recognized that as the moment the scale of the betrayal finally began to sink in. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the tiny, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. "The file," Willis said eventually, "the one you backed up independently. Can you access it from here?" "Give me a terminal with external network access," she replied. "I need 4 minutes." He gestured toward a console in the corner, a relic of a workstation that looked like it hadn't been touched in a year. Emily moved to it, her fingers stiff but accurate. She pulled up the backup server through a pathway she had spent weeks building in the dark hours of the night, a ghost trail that existed entirely outside the unit's primary network. It was a contingency she had hoped she would never need, a secret digital bunker for the truth. She pulled the file up and turned the screen toward him. "Willis, read." He read for 7 minutes in total silence, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes, making them look like cold glass. When he finally looked up, his face had changed in a way Emily didn't have a word for. It was the expression of a man looking at a wound he had hoped was a scratch, only to realize it was a terminal infection. "This goes back 4 years," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes," she said. "There are 17 separate signal events cross-referenced in that summary view." 19, she corrected him. 2 of them don't display in the summary. You have to open the sub-files. They were hidden deeper, masked by layers of administrative noise. He opened the sub-files. He looked at the raw data, the timestamps, the intercepted bursts of encrypted traffic that should have been caught by any competent officer in the chain of command. He closed them again, his movements slow and deliberate. "Carter," he said, and then he stopped. He seemed to be searching for a question that wasn't already answered by the data in front of him. "Who else has seen this?" "No one," she said. "I built the pathway independently. These files were never on the unit network. Every summary I submitted to Hargrove was clean. Just the highlights, none of the full source data, and every one of those was dismissed or deleted. The source data has only ever existed on this backup server. Then no one in the chain of command knows the full extent of what you've documented," Willis noted. "No one in the compromised portion of the chain of command," she replied. "But you know now." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers as if looking for a crack in her resolve. "You came to me specifically. Why?" "Because you're a dinosaur," she said, and for the first time a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Every briefing I ever gave you, I watched you. You didn't type into a tablet. You wrote everything down in a physical notebook that you kept in your pocket. You kept your own record on paper, outside the network, which means it can't be altered retroactively by a software patch or a system error. And tonight, you acted on my radio transmission without waiting for a confirmation through the standard channels. You trusted your gut over the protocol. Those 2 things told me you were the only one left who could hear this." Willis was quiet again. Then he said, very softly, "You were analyzing me." "I analyze everything," she said. "It isn't personal. It's just how I stay alive." A flicker of something, perhaps the beginning of a grim smile, moved across Willis's face before he suppressed it. "Morrow filed a report at 0300, he said, his voice dropping an octave. "He listed you as missing, presumed dead. He cited wounds sustained during enemy contact and stated your body was unrecoverable due to tactical conditions." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. It wasn't a surprise. She had already deduced this was the likely move while she was dragging herself through the mud. But hearing it in the flat, sterile language of an official report made her chest tighten. "He was going to need me dead before the debrief," she said. "If I'm dead, the questions stop. If I walk back through that gate, the questions start, and the answers lead somewhere he can't survive." "He's currently in the operations center," Willis said. "He's writing up the full action report as we speak." "Don't tell him I'm here," she said, her voice sharp with sudden urgency. "Not yet. Sergeant Major, the figure from the ridge, the one at the rear of the column, he isn't in our system. If Hargrove has been running interference for 4 years, that's expected. But that man knew my name. He knew my age. He knew my capabilities. That isn't general battlefield intelligence. That's someone who's been reading our internal assessments." Willis straightened slowly, his posture regaining the rigid authority of his rank. The implications of her words hung in the air between them like a toxic mist. "Internal assessments," he repeated. "Personnel evaluations, capability profiles, the kind of documents that are supposed to be locked behind the highest levels of our administrative security." She met his eyes. "Someone has been feeding him our internal lives. Morrow or Hargrove, or maybe both of them. He knew enough about me to order a confirmation of my death. That means the leak has been active long enough to include my entire personnel file." Willis turned back to the screen, looking at the 19 signal events, the 4-year timeline, and the meticulous, patient care with which she had built her case. She had documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that evidence is only a weapon if it's irrefutable. "I need to make a call," Willis said, "outside the unit. Outside this entire chain of command." "Yes," she said. "You do. This is going to take time to unravel," he warned her. "People are going to question your methods. They'll look at your age, your lack of experience, the way you handled the chain of custody. They'll try to tear this apart just to save themselves the embarrassment of having missed it. Let them," she said. "The file is complete. The logs are time-stamped and cross-referenced against 3 independent databases. The transmission record from tonight is in your own operations log, and I can reproduce every single detail of what I saw tonight from memory, including the cadence of the man at the rear, which matches the pattern documented in event number 11. I've been building this for 6 months, Sergeant Major. I didn't build it to lose an argument. The door opened then, and Dr. Yates stepped in. She carried a field kit and moved with the focused, quiet efficiency of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know when to keep her mouth shut. She looked at Emily, then at Willis, and finally at the blood-stained clothes. She set her kit on the table without a word. "I'm going to need to examine that wound," Yates said to Emily. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a clinical directive. "I know," Emily said. "Give me 30 more seconds." She turned back to Willis. The withdrawal route they took. They went northeast. There's a staging area in the high ground near the old mining sector. I can give you the approximate grid. If you move now, if you get aerial assets over that location immediately, you might catch them before they clear out. Willis already had his radio in his hand. 30 seconds, he said. "Give me the grid." She gave him the coordinates. He transmitted them in clipped, flat tones that betrayed nothing of the conversation they just had. Emily watched him, listening to the crackle of the response from the operations center. The base was coming alive around a new priority. In the background of the transmission, she heard a voice she recognized. Lieutenant Hargrove, asking what was happening, why assets were being diverted. "Weather observation," Willis said into the radio, his voice a wall of granite. "Stand down, Lieutenant." Hargrove's voice went quiet. It was a specific kind of silence, one that Emily filed away in her mind. Willis put the radio down and looked at her. The expression on his face had shifted again. He was no longer calculating, he was acting. "Get the wound looked at," he said. "Do not speak to anyone except Yates until I come back. That includes anyone who outranks me, especially anyone who outranks me. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. Willis paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Carter, how long did you say you've been building that file?" 6 months and 11 days, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, his unreadable expression finally becoming clear to her. It was the look of a man who was having to completely recalibrate his understanding of what an 18-year-old was capable of. "All right," he said, and then he was gone. Dr. Yates moved to Emily's side. She didn't waste time with small talk. She began cutting away the outer layer of the field, dressing with practiced, steady hands. The room was silent except for the snip of the shears and the distant sound of the base's activity rampaging outside the walls. Yates examined the wound with a small, bright light, her silence a professional courtesy that Emily appreciated. "You did good work on this," Yates said after a minute. "The dressing was professional." "I had a good teacher," Emily replied. "My own field manual, mostly." She hesitated, then added, "and a woman named Pat Odom." Yates looked up, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "I know Patricia Odom. She retired out of this command 2 years ago." A strange look crossed the doctor's face. "She talked about you, you know. She said she had a trainee who was either going to be extraordinary or get herself killed being extraordinary." Emily stared up at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. "What did she vote for?" "Extraordinary," Yates said. "By a wide margin." Something cracked open in Emily's chest. Not tears, she was far too exhausted for that, but a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. It was the feeling of being known, truly known, by the right person at the right time. It was a sensation she'd experienced so rarely that it felt almost like a physical blow. "Tell me when this is going to hurt," Emily said, bracing herself. "It's going to hurt now," Yates said. She applied pressure, and Emily's world narrowed down to the rhythm of her own breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Outside the room, she could hear the bass shifting. The quality of the activity was changing. The radio traffic was picking up, the specific, organized chaos of a system reorganizing itself around a crisis. She couldn't hear the individual words, but she knew the shape of the sound. It was the sound of people realizing they had been blind and desperately trying to see. She heard Hargrove's voice again at one point, raised in a brief, frustrated protest. It was cut short by Willis's voice, flat, final, and utterly non-negotiable. Then there was only the hum of the equipment and the steady, focused work of the doctor. Yates was replacing the field packing, cleaning the edges of the wound with a meticulousness that spoke of years in the field. Emily answered her clinical questions with the same precision she'd used for the briefing, her mind already moving past the pain and onto the next phase of the board. 40 minutes after she had first walked through the perimeter, a sound made her go perfectly still. It wasn't a loud noise, just the sound of a door closing in the corridor outside. It wasn't slammed. It was closed with a controlled, deliberate force that suggested a man who was fighting to keep his temper in check. Then came the footsteps. She knew those footsteps. She had heard them walking away from her in the mud 3 hours ago. It was Morrow. He was in the corridor, moving fast, then pausing, then moving again. The rhythm of his gait had changed. It was too fast, too urgent. It was the movement of someone who had received a piece of information they weren't supposed to have, and was now frantically trying to decide their next move. Someone had told him she was alive. It wouldn't have been Willis, but there were too many people in the operations center, too many eyes in the halls. Someone had seen the medical supplies moving toward the secondary comms room and had drawn the only logical conclusion. Emily looked at Yates, locked the door. Yates looked up, confused. "I'm sorry." The door, Emily repeated, her voice low and sharp. "Lock it, right now." Yates didn't ask for an explanation. She saw something in Emily's eyes that was more than enough. She stood, crossed the room, and engaged the heavy deadbolt. 3 seconds later, the handle on the other side of the door rattled. It didn't turn. There was a pause, a heavy silence, and then Morrow's voice drifted through the metal. "Carter, I know you're in there. I just want to talk." Emily looked at the door. She thought about the way his boot had ground into the mud next to her head. She thought about his words in the rain, "Asterisk, you're a liability now." Asterisk, she thought about the way he'd taken her rifle, leaving her defenseless in the dark. She thought about the report he'd filed, declaring her dead so he could bury his secrets with her. "Sergeant Major Willis told me not to speak to anyone until he returned," Emily said, her voice clear and carrying no emotion. "I'm following his orders, Sergeant. If you want to have a conversation, you can wait until he's here." There was a long silence from the other side. "You don't understand what you're walking into," Morrow said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "I understand it exactly," she replied. "That's the problem you're dealing with." Another silence, even longer this time. She could hear his breathing, labored, controlled, but not perfectly. And then she heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. They stopped a short distance away. Then the distinct sound of a radio being keyed. It was a specific pattern. 2 short clicks, a pause, then another. It was the same double-click pattern she had documented 6 months ago. The same frequency signature she'd cross-referenced 19 times. She looked at Yates. The doctor was staring at the door, her face pale. "That man," Emily said quietly, "just signaled the same network I've been tracking for half a year. Which means I now have a live signal event connected directly to a member of this unit, caught in real time. Tell me you have a recording system in here." Yates blinked, her training kicking back in. She crossed to the console and pressed a sequence of switches. "Standard backup recording," she said. "It goes to a separate archive independent of the main system. Did it catch the transmission signature if the room's passive sensors were active?" Yates checked the screen. They were. "Yes, we have it." Emily closed her eyes for 3 full seconds. When she opened them, she was already calculating. She had survived the mountain, she had survived the abandonment, and now she had the final piece of the puzzle. She hadn't just survived the night, she had broken it wide open. She had turned an execution into the most documented intelligence event in 4 years of covert operations. "Yates," she said, "finish the dressing. Then I need you to stay in this room and protect that archive. Don't let anyone touch it except Willis. Can you do that?" Yates looked at the door, then at the console, and finally back at Emily. She looked like a woman who was realizing she had just stepped from one world into another and that there was no going back. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." Emily nodded and leaned back against the examination table. She practiced her breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She had a treated wound. She had an airtight file. She had a live capture of a trader's signal. She had a sergeant major making a call to the highest levels of the Inspector General's office. And somewhere in the mountains to the northeast, aerial assets were descending on a grid coordinate she had provided. She had always known in the quietest part of her soul that if she could just stay alive long enough, she would have enough. The door didn't move again. Morrow didn't come back. In the distance, she heard the low, rhythmic thrum of helicopters, the sound of the end. Willis didn't return until 0617. Emily knew the exact time because she had been counting the intervals between the base's automated perimeter sweeps. The habit of analysis was her only defense against the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She heard his footsteps in the corridor a full 12 seconds before the knock came, 3 measured, heavy strikes. It was the rhythm of a man who had seen the world burn and was now coming to tell her what was left of the ashes. Yates unlocked the door and Willis stepped inside. He looked at Emily, his eyes taking in her upright posture and the way she had maintained her focus despite the blood loss and the trauma. He didn't offer praise, he offered facts. Aerial assets reached the staging area at 0558, he said. They found 11 personnel still on site. They were in the middle of a tactical extraction. They didn't clear out in time. Emily felt the air in the room shift. 11, she asked. The column I saw had 12 plus the man at the rear. The man at the rear wasn't there, Willis said. He cleared the area before our assets arrived. Someone warned him. Emily didn't hesitate. Morrow keyed his radio at 0451. The passive sensors in this room captured the transmission. It's an exact match for the frequency pattern in my file. Event number 19. Willis looked at Yates, who nodded toward the console. I know, he said. I pulled Morrow from duty at 0510. He's in administrative detention. He hasn't said a word since I told him about the recording. He's already asked for a lawyer. Of course he has, Emily said. He knew the moment I walked back into this base that his life was over. He was just trying to save whatever was left of his network. Willis walked to the console and looked at the archive Yates had been guarding. He didn't touch it, he just stared at the data as if it were a physical weight. Lieutenant Hargrove is also in detention, he added, his voice like cold iron. He's claiming a medical emergency. He's trying to buy time. There's nothing wrong with him, Emily noted. No, Willis agreed. There isn't. But the 11 people we picked up at the staging area are currently being processed. 3 of them were carrying physical documentation that links directly to 2 of the events in your file. He finally looked at her, his expression more somber than she had ever seen it. Your file, Carter. The chain of custody on that evidence is going to be the most scrutinized document in the history of this command. I need to know for the last time that it's airtight. It is, she said. Every entry is time-stamped. The access logs are clean. The pathway I built was invisible to the unit's administrative oversight. Hargrove couldn't have touched it even if he knew it existed. The file is clean. It's always been clean. Willis stood in the silence for a long moment. There's a colonel arriving at 0800, he said. Marcus Webb. He's from the Criminal Investigation Division, working directly for the Inspector General. I called him from a private line the moment I finished reading your file. Emily processed the timeline. You called him before you knew about Morrow's radio signal. I called him the moment I realized what you had handed me, Willis said. 19 cross-referenced events over 4 years isn't just a mistake. It's a conspiracy, and I'm not letting this unit investigate itself. He took a step toward her, his gaze intense. You did something tonight that most veterans with 20 years of service wouldn't have had the stomach for. You stayed alive, you kept your head, and you brought back the truth. But you need to understand what happens next. When that colonel gets here, you are the star witness. They are going to dig into your life. They're going to look for any reason to doubt you. I've been digging into my own life for 18 years, Sergeant Major, she said, her voice steady. There's nothing they can find that I haven't already analyzed. Willis nodded, a slow, respectful movement of his head. I believe you. Now let the doctor finish. We've got a long morning ahead of us. As Willis turned to leave, Emily felt the first real wave of exhaustion hit her. It was a heavy, sinking feeling, but it wasn't the darkness of defeat. It was the weight of a mission accomplished. She looked at the small room, the flickering monitors, and the steady hands of Dr. Yates. Outside, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting a pale, gray light over a base that would never be the same again. She had spent 6 months being the only person who saw the ghost in the machine. She had spent a night being the liability that wouldn't die. And now, she was the person who was going to watch the whole house of cards come falling down. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sound of the helicopters returning, and for the first time since she had arrived at the base, she let herself breathe without counting the seconds. The investigation would be brutal. The lawyers would be relentless. The men who had betrayed her would fight with everything they had to stay out of the light. But Emily wasn't afraid. She had the data. She had the truth. And she had the memory of a rainy gully and a man who thought he could leave her behind. She opened her eyes and looked at Dr. Yates. Is it done? Almost, Yates said, her voice soft. Just a few more minutes, Carter. You're doing fine. I know, Emily said. I always am. She watched the door, waiting for 0800, waiting for the colonel, waiting for the beginning of the end. She was very good at waiting. She had had a lot of practice, and tonight the wait was finally over. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with secrets. It was clear, sharp, and full of the coming storm. And Emily, the girl they had left for dead, was right in the center of it, exactly where she was meant to be. The rain had stopped outside, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed raw and honest. The morning air, when it finally reached her through the vents, was cold and smelled of high altitudes and clean starts. She felt the weight of the file in her mind, every byte of data, every signal, every betrayal now organized and ready for use. She wasn't just a soldier anymore, and she wasn't just an analyst. She was the record of everything they had tried to hide. As the clock on the wall ticked toward the hour, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. The pain in her side was a dull thrum now, a reminder of the price of the truth, but it was a price she was more than willing to pay. She looked at her hands, still stained with the mud of the North Gully, and she didn't wash them. She wanted the colonel to see exactly where she had come from. She wanted him to see the mud and the blood and the evidence of a woman who had refused to be a liability. The first rays of the sun hit the high mountains, turning the peaks to a jagged, brilliant gold. Somewhere out there, the man at the rear of the column was still moving, still running. But the loop was closing. The signal had been caught. The silence had been broken. And Emily Carter was still standing. She took one last deep breath, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and waited for the knock on the door that would change everything. The world was waking up, and she was ready to tell it the truth. The silence that followed Willis's admission felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down into the small, dimly lit room. He looked at Emily, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and a sudden, sharp clarity. It was the look of a man who had finally seen the shape of the ghost that had been haunting his unit for months. Emily watched him, her own expression carefully neutral despite the throbbing pain in her shoulder. She had known the truth, or at least the shape of it, for a while, but hearing it confirmed by the man who had been meant to oversee the integrity of the operation changed the atmosphere. "You believed it that fast," she observed, her voice low. Willis didn't blink. He said he believed it the moment she told him Harrove had dismissed the same pattern 3 separate times. He explained his reasoning with the flat, clinical logic of a career officer. Incompetence might dismiss something once, he told her. Maybe twice if you're feeling particularly generous or if the analyst is new. But 3 times? When it's the same analyst, the same specific signal pattern, and it leads to the same lack of result, that's no longer an oversight. That's a decision. He paused, a flicker of something like shame crossing his features. "I've known Harrove for 7 years," he admitted, his voice dropping an octave. "I should have seen it sooner." He was a man who prided himself on his situational awareness, yet the betrayal had been happening right under his nose, masked by the mundane bureaucracy of daily intelligence reports. Emily didn't respond to his regret. There was nothing she could say that would make it better, and in the world they inhabited, some regrets needed to be held privately before they could be picked apart and examined for lessons. This was Willis's burden to carry, not hers. She had her own ghosts to manage. Instead, she shifted the focus back to the immediate reality. "Colonel Webb," she said, bringing the conversation back to the man currently en route to their location. "What exactly does he need from me?" Willis didn't hesitate. "He needs everything you have in sequence, starting from the very first signal event and moving forward through every anomaly you tracked." Willis reached into his pocket and pulled out a physical notebook. Emily recognized it immediately. It was his most reliable record, a constant companion that never left his side. The spine was worn, the leather scuffed from years of being shoved into pockets and onto desks, and it was filled with small, precise handwriting that looked like a code in itself. He opened it to a fresh page, the paper white and unforgiving in the harsh light. "I want to go through it with you before he arrives," Willis said, his pen hovering over the page. "I want to be able to corroborate every single point that intersects with what you briefed me directly." It was a smart move, a way to ensure their stories were airtight before the heavy hitters arrived. Emily checked the time. "How long do we have?" she asked. Willis checked his watch with a quick, practiced flick of his wrist. "An hour and 40 minutes. Emily nodded. "That's enough." They spent the next 100 minutes in a world of data and memory. Emily worked primarily from her mind, a tool she had spent years honing until it functioned like a high-speed processor. She could recall the exact frequency shifts, the timestamps, and the subtle variations in signal strength as if they were printed on the back of her eyelids. Willis, meanwhile, used his notebook as an independent anchor. It was the unalterable record of every conversation that had passed through his briefing room over the last 6 months. They moved methodically, piece by piece, building a bridge between her observations and his documentation. By the time they reached the end of the timeline, They had found 11 points of direct intersection. 11 moments where Emily had presented him with evidence of a burgeoning threat, and Willis had dutifully recorded it. The implications were staggering. Harrove had been present for 4 of those 11 conversations. On 3 of those 4 occasions, a major signal event, an ambush, a supply raid, or a movement of hostile assets had occurred within 72 hours of the briefing. The frequency wasn't just a coincidence, it was a heartbeat. It was communication. The pattern was undeniable. Hargrove was receiving intelligence from Emily's summaries and passing it forward to the enemy before the unit could act on it. When Emily finally laid out the full sequence, the sheer elegance of the betrayal hung in the air like smoke. Willis set his pen down on the table, his hands steady but his face pale. "He was using your intelligence summaries to warn them," he whispered. "The summaries you submitted to him specifically." Emily nodded, her jaw tight. "Yes. That's why he dismissed them officially. It wasn't to bury the information, it was to control it. He wanted the official records to show that nothing actionable had been found, which gave him the cover he needed to pass the actual content forward on his own timeline. He was functioning as a filter. Everything I brought to him was screened. If it was dangerous to his network, he dismissed it officially and transmitted it privately. If it wasn't dangerous, he dismissed it anyway just to maintain consistency." She paused, thinking about the calculated coldness of the man they had once trusted. "He was careful," she added. "He even dismissed things that were genuinely nothing, just so the pattern of his dismissals wouldn't look like a pattern." The only thing he hadn't accounted for was Emily's own internal tracking system. She hadn't just been tracking the signals, she had been tracking his reactions to them. Willis looked at her with a new kind of respect, or perhaps it was a realization of just how dangerous she was. "You were tracking his dismissals?" he asked. Emily gave him a look that suggested there was no other way to exist. "I was tracking everything," she said. "That's what I do." Willis picked up his pen again and wrote a single line in his notebook. He didn't share what it was, and Emily didn't ask. She trusted that whatever he was recording was accurate and would remain so, a small island of truth in a sea of deception. At 0740, the room changed. There was no knock, just the sharp click of the latch and the door swinging open. A man walked in who Emily didn't recognize, but whose presence filled the small space instantly. He was in his mid-50s, compact and built with a sense of purpose. He possessed the kind of physical stillness that only comes from decades of interviewing people who desperately want to hide the truth. He looked at Willis first, a brief acknowledgement of rank and history, and then his gaze settled on Emily. It lingered, assessing more than just the bandage on her shoulder or the dark circles under her eyes. He was looking for the core of her. "Colonel Webb," Willis said, standing at attention. "Sergeant Major." Webb didn't look away from Emily. "Carter," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "You look like you've had a difficult night," Webb remarked. Emily didn't flinch. "I've had an informative one," she countered. A ghost of a movement appeared at the corner of Webb's mouth, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of a response that was far more interesting than the standard "yes, sir" he likely expected. He set a briefcase on the table, an old-fashioned leather thing with actual brass clasps that clicked with a satisfying weight. He sat down across from her, folded his large, scarred hands, and got straight to the point. "Start from the beginning," he commanded. "Don't summarize, don't editorialize. Just tell me what you observed, what you documented, and in what sequence." Emily began to speak. She talked for 53 minutes without stopping, her voice a low, rhythmic drone in the quiet room. Webb interrupted her only 6 times. He didn't challenge her facts. He asked for clarification on sequences, demanded she specify whether a detail was a direct observation or a logical inference, and confirmed timestamps against his own records. It was then that Emily realized Webb hadn't arrived empty-handed. He had records, files she hadn't seen, data points she hadn't been privy to. She didn't know where they had come from, and she didn't ask, but their existence told her everything she needed to know. Whatever Willis's 0330 phone call had set in motion, it had landed in the hands of someone who had already been looking in this very direction. When she reached the 40-minute mark, she described the figure at the rear of the withdrawing column, the one who had cleared the staging area before the assets arrived, the one who had known her name before the sun had even risen. Webb's pen, which had been moving in a steady rhythm, suddenly stopped. "Describe the movement pattern again," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Emily closed her eyes and visualized the ridge. "The flat, measured pace," she said, "the squared shoulders, the absolute absence of any urgency. The specific way he paused at the end of the column and turned to look back at the ridge. He wasn't scanning for threats, he wasn't searching. He was looking with the deliberate attention of someone performing a final check. It was a professional's gaze. Webb wrote something in his notes that took much longer than his previous entries. "You mentioned the American cadence," he said, looking back up. "On the radio in the North Gully." Emily nodded. "Yes, and the frequency pattern is documented in my file as Event 11. If you cross-reference Event 11 with Event 14 and Event 16, you'll find the same operator on all 3 occasions. The cadence pattern is consistent." Webb narrowed his eyes. "You can identify individual operators by cadence pattern?" he asked, a hint of skepticism coloring his tone. "By cadence pattern and by the micro-timing between syllables," Emily explained. "It's the same principle as voice recognition, but it's more resilient. It works on encrypted transmissions where the voice itself is digitally masked. The timing patterns, the way a person breathes between words, the rhythm of their speech, those things survive encryption." Webb put his pen down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It was somewhere between professional assessment and something deeply personal, the look of a man who was having to rapidly update a long-held assumption. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. "Identifying operators by cadence? Since I was 16, Emily said. I used to do it with radio broadcasts and news programs. I could tell when a substitute reader was filling in for their regular anchor because the micro-timing was off. It was just a game back then. I only got serious about it when I entered reconnaissance training and realized it had operational value." Webb picked up his pen again, his face a mask. "Your evaluations describe your audio processing abilities as exceptional," he noted. Emily felt a sharp pang of irony. "My evaluations were written by Harrove, sir, which means they should be read very carefully." Webb didn't skip a beat. "Your evaluations describe your audio processing abilities as exceptional and your judgment as occasionally overconfident for your experience level." Emily absorbed the critique without emotion. "He would say that," she replied. "He said it 3 times across 3 separate evaluation cycles. It was consistent with his approach to everything else. Dismiss the analysis, qualify the analyst. He was creating a record that made the patterns I found look like personal whims rather than systematic suppression." She paused, looking at the 2 men. It was smart. I'll give him that. If tonight hadn't happened the way it did, those evaluations would have been the official record of who I was. They would have told the world how seriously to take my work, which is to say, not at all. Webb looked at her for a moment longer, that same unclassifiable expression on his face. Then he leaned forward, the air in the room suddenly feeling even tighter. "The figure at the rear of the column, the operator from Event 11, he said. "I have a name." The room went quiet in a very specific way. It was the quality of silence that descends when a theory finally becomes a fact, when a shadow that has been sensed in the dark finally steps into the light and reveals its face. Emily didn't speak. She didn't even breathe. She just waited. "His name is Richard Calloway," Webb said. "Former Defense Intelligence Agency. Retired 8 years ago under circumstances that were described officially as voluntary separation for personal reasons. Unofficially, he was the subject of an internal investigation that was closed without findings 14 months after it opened." Webb's voice was as flat as the horizon. "He has been listed as a person of interest in 2 separate investigations in the past 4 years. Neither investigation produced actionable evidence. Because the evidence was being filtered," Emily said, finishing the thought. "That's the current hypothesis," Webb agreed. "Your signal logs are the first documentation we have that places him in direct operational communication with assets in this region. The cadence identification on Event 11, if it holds up to independent acoustic analysis, puts him personally on the radio during an operation that we can now connect to Harrove and Morrow through direct evidence." He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "That's a chain, Carter. A chain we have not previously been able to build." Emily's mind raced back through the months of work. She thought about the boring Tuesday mornings, the forgettable briefing rooms, and the 19 entries in a backup file she had hidden outside the unit network. She had done it because she knew, at some deep level she couldn't have articulated at the time, that the network couldn't be trusted. She thought about Harrove's voice telling her she was reading too much into signal noise. "He knew about me specifically," she said, the realization cold in her chest. "Before tonight, Calloway knew my name, my age, and exactly what I was capable of. That means Hargrove was forwarding my personnel evaluations directly to him. Webb nodded slowly. Which means Calloway assessed you as a threat to the network long before tonight. And Morrow was given the order to resolve that threat if the opportunity presented itself. Emily felt the phantom sensation of the mud against her cheek. The ambush wasn't just about Miller's Crossing, she whispered. Leaving me in the gully, it was a planned element. It wasn't improvised. They needed me dead before I could debrief. The weight of that truth settled into the room like lead. Willis, who had been standing silently in the corner, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but it communicated a deep, roiling anger. Webb broke the silence. We're going to need your formal testimony on record, under oath, in front of a military tribunal that operates entirely outside this command's chain of authority. That process will take time to convene. Emily looked at him. How much time? Days? Webb sighed. Possibly a week. In the meantime, Emily said, her voice sharp, Calloway is in the wind. In the meantime, Webb agreed, Calloway is in the wind. We have assets moving on known contact points based on your signal logs, but the man is a professional. 23 years of intelligence experience and the specific advantage of knowing that we are now actively looking. He paused, his gaze intensifying. He also knows you survived the night. Morrow told him. Emily remembered the transmission at 0451. Yes, she said. He knows I walked out of those mountains. He knows I have the file, and he knows that whatever he thought he was managing became significantly more complicated in the last 3 hours. She thought about the flat voice on the radio saying, she's not the kind to stop. He'll try again, she said. It wasn't a question. She wasn't afraid, she was just identifying an operational variable. He'll try again, Webb confirmed, which is why from this moment forward you are under protective protocol. You go nowhere without an escort cleared by my office. You communicate through no channel that isn't independently verified. And you do not, under any circumstances, attempt to operate independently in this investigation. Emily met his eyes, her own sparking with a brief flash of defiance. With respect, Colonel, operating independently is exactly what produced the evidence you're currently building a case on. Webb didn't look offended. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you directly rather than expecting the instruction to be sufficient on its own. There was something in his voice that was almost humor, or perhaps just the tone of a man who had accurately assessed the person he was talking to. You are 18 years old, he reminded her. You have a bullet wound. You have been awake for approximately 22 hours. At some point tonight, your body is going to make decisions without consulting your judgment. And I would prefer that when it does, you are somewhere with medical supervision and a locked door. Emily wanted to argue. She felt the counter-arguments lining up in her mind with the automatic efficiency of a system that didn't know how to stop. She had a list of things to do, a list of signals to check, a list of connections to verify. But then, underneath all that mental noise, she felt the thing she'd been holding at bay all night. The exhaustion arrived. Not the manageable tiredness she'd been cataloging, but a deep, structural collapse. Her hands were shaking. They'd been shaking for a while, she realized, and setting it aside was no longer an option. All right, she said softly. Webb nodded once. The file, he said. I need full access credentials to the backup pathway before you sleep. Emily gave them to him. She walked him through the backup pathway step by step, the same methodical sequence she had used to build it. She watched him access the file on the console, and she watched his face as he opened the sub-files. 1, 2, 3. She saw the moment when the sheer scope of her work became clear to him. 19 entries, 6 months of data, cross-referenced against 3 independent databases, time-stamped, annotated, and sourced. When he finally closed the file, he looked at her for a long moment with that same look of recalibration. This is exceptional work, he said. I know, Emily replied. It wasn't arrogance, it was just a statement of fact. This time, Webb actually smiled, a tiny fractional movement. Sleep, Carter, we'll talk more when you've had 4 hours. Willis walked her to the medical bay himself. They didn't speak for most of the walk, the silence between them filled with the hum of the base camp and the distant sound of rain. It was the right call. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be better handled once the adrenaline had cleared. But at the door of the medical bay, Willis stopped. Morrow came up through the same program I did, he said, his voice quiet. Same training cycle, same instructors. I sponsored his application for this command 2 years ago. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I wanted you to know that I understand the specific weight of what you brought me tonight. It wasn't just intelligence. It was a decision to trust someone when trust had given you every reason to be finished with it. Emily looked at him. She thought about the measured, professional responses she could give, the ones that would keep the appropriate distance. But she didn't use them. "You wrote things down in a notebook you kept on your person," she said. "You acted on my radio transmission without waiting for confirmation. You called Webb from a personal line before you even knew about Morrow's signal." She paused, her voice steady. "You earned it." Willis nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could. Then he left. Inside the medical bay, Yates was already waiting. She'd been moved from the communications room, her role in protecting the archive apparently complete. She directed Emily to a bed with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all night. As Emily sat on the edge of the mattress, the 22 hours finally crashed over her like a tide. She felt her body finally giving up the fight. She thought about Calloway, moving through a world that had just become much more dangerous for him and for her. The investigation would take time, and Calloway had plenty of that, along with the resources to disappear. The personnel in custody might talk, or they might stay loyal to the network. There were so many variables. What she wasn't used to was being the one protected. The escort, the locked door, she understood the logic, but she didn't know how to be that person. She'd never had to learn. Yates came over, checked her dressing one last time, and handed her a protein bar. "You need to eat," she said. Emily didn't argue. She ate the bar, then a second one Yates produced from somewhere, and drank water until she couldn't swallow anymore. Then she lay back and looked at the ceiling. The sounds of the base camp were different now. She could hear Webb's voice in the operations center, low and purposeful. She could hear the radio traffic building as multiple operations were coordinated. She could hear a vehicle departing toward the eastern approach. But she couldn't hear Calloway. He was out there beyond her reach, moving through the dark with that flat, deliberate pace. "I'll find you," she thought. "Not tonight, but soon." The file was in Webb's hands, the chain was built, and the backup server was out of reach of those who wanted her gone. Calloway had told his scout she wasn't the kind to stop. He was right. As her eyes drifted shut, she thought about Dale Morrow. She thought about the exact moment he had dropped her onto the mud and turned away, thinking she was a non-entity, a ghost already gone. That specific act of cruelty had been his greatest mistake. If he had just left her, she might have been too disoriented to hear the signal in the north gully. She might not have climbed the ridge, but his need to be thorough, his need to break her, had given her the final 30 seconds of motivation she needed to do more than just survive. She almost wanted to thank him for it. The sound of the base camp settled around her, a mountain settling after a storm. For the first time in nearly a day, the listening finally went quiet. She slept. And while she slept, Richard Calloway drove north on an unmarked road, a man who believed he still had time. He was wrong. Emily woke up at 11:14 in the morning. She didn't wake slowly. She snapped into consciousness with the absolute certainty that something was wrong. It wasn't a dream or a noise. It was a thought that had been cooking in her subconscious while she rested, a document left open on the desk of her mind. The 11 personnel in custody. She sat up, ignoring the sharp pull of her wound. 11. Webb had said 11 personnel were recovered at the staging area. One had cleared with Calloway before the assets arrived. That was the math she had accepted last night. 13 total minus Calloway, and the one who left early equals 11. The math was perfect. So why was she sitting here with her heart hammering against her ribs? She closed her eyes and went back to the ridge, back to the rain and the dark and the figures moving northeast. She counted them again in her mind. The heavy one, the nervous scout, the others in their tactical spacing. And then she saw it. The scout who had searched for her at the overhang, the one who had reported to Calloway that she'd bleed out by morning. He had been in the gully. He had been on the radio at 0451, but he hadn't been in the withdrawing column. She had tracked every single figure from the ridge, and that specific erratic movement signature was missing from the formation. The scout hadn't withdrawn with the main element, which meant he was still out there, still in the mountains. Emily was off the bed before she had even finished the thought. She ignored the protest of her body as she moved toward the door, her mind already racing through the implications. She needed a radio, and she needed someone with the authority to listen before she had to explain the math. The corridor was empty, but she could hear voices to the left. She headed toward them, her eyes scanning for a duty officer, her focus absolute. The game wasn't over. It had just changed. She found a duty officer she didn't recognize at a desk, a man looking startled as she approached with the intensity of a predator. She didn't wait for him to ask what she wanted. "I need to speak to Colonel Webb," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the morning like a blade. "Now." The officer began to protest, mentioning protocols and her medical status, but Emily didn't let him finish. "Tell him the math is wrong," she commanded. "Tell him there were 12 in the gully, but only 11 in the column. He'll understand." The officer hesitated, caught between the rules and the sheer, terrifying certainty in Emily's eyes. He picked up the phone. As he spoke, Emily leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She could feel the world tightening around her again, the variables shifting, the patterns reforming. The scout was the missing link, the one piece of the puzzle that Calloway had left behind, either by design or by accident. And in the high-stakes world of signals and shadows, a single missing piece was enough to bring the whole structure crashing down. She waited, her ears already tuning back into the frequency of the bass, listening for the shift in tone that would tell her the hunt was back on. The duty officer hung up the phone, his face pale. "The colonel is on his way," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, her mind already moving past the room, past the base, and back into the cold, rain-slicked peaks of the mountains. She wasn't just an analyst anymore, she was the hunter. And she wouldn't stop until the math was finally perfectly balanced. The air in the hallway seemed to vibrate with a sudden, renewed tension. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began a low, rhythmic pulse, signaling a change in the base's posture. Emily felt a grim satisfaction. The machine was waking up, responding to the data she had provided. Webb appeared at the end of the corridor, his pace brisk, his face a mask of concentrated energy. He didn't say a word until he was standing directly in front of her. "Show me," he said. Emily didn't need a map or a computer. She used the air between them, sketching out the movements of the night with her hands. 12 men in the gully, sir. I tracked their signatures, one reported to Calloway. But the column that left, only 11. The scout stayed behind, he's the shadow we missed." Webb stared at her, the gears of his own mind turning at a ferocious speed. If he stayed, he had a reason, he muttered, more to himself than to her. A secondary staging area, Emily suggested, or a cache, or he was tasked with a final sweep. Either way, he's the one who can lead us to Calloway's bolt hole. Webb nodded, then turned to the duty officer. "Get me a direct line to the aerial assets. I want a thermal sweep of the North Gully and the surrounding 3-mile radius. Now." As the officer scrambled to obey, Webb turned back to Emily. "You should be in bed, Carter." Emily didn't move. "I'll go back when the math is right, sir." Webb looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine admiration in his eyes. "Fine," he said. "But you stay here in the ops center. If we find him, I want you on the headset. You're the only one who knows his rhythm." They moved together into the heart of the operations room, a space filled with glowing screens and the low hum of high-frequency radios. Emily sat at a terminal, her wound forgotten, her focus narrowed down to a single point of light on a digital map. The hunt had entered its final phase. The scout was out there, thinking he was safe in the shadows, but he didn't realize that the shadows had eyes, and those eyes belonged to Emily Carter. The thermal feed began to flicker onto the main screen, blobs of white and gray representing the heat signatures of the mountain. It was a chaotic mess of rock and vegetation, but Emily's eyes filtered through the noise with ease. She wasn't looking for a person, she was looking for a pattern. A movement that didn't belong to the wind or the wildlife. "There," she said, pointing to a small, jagged ravine 2 miles north of the original ambush site. "That's him." The signature was faint, tucked under a rocky overhang, but it was there, a pulsing heat that betrayed a human presence. "He's waiting for a pickup," Emily whispered. Webb grabbed a headset. "All units, target acquired. Sector 4 Alpha, move in for extraction. Do not engage unless fired upon. I want him alive." The room held its breath as the icons on the map began to converge on the tiny white dot. Emily watched, her heart thumping in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She could almost hear the scout's breath, almost feel his desperation. He was the key, the final link in the chain that would lead them directly to Richard Calloway. And as the tactical teams closed in, Emily felt the weight of the last 24 hours finally begin to lift. The math was closing. The pattern was complete. The dot on the screen suddenly flared as the tactical team moved in, the thermal signature of the flashbangs momentarily blinding the sensors. Then a voice crackled over the radio. "Target secure. We have the package." The room erupted into a brief, controlled cheer, but Emily remained silent. She watched the screen until the thermal signatures began to move back toward the base, a slow, steady procession of victory. Webb turned to her, his face weary but satisfied. "We got him, Carter. Now we get the truth." Emily nodded, her eyes finally losing their sharp, predatory edge. "Yes, sir," she said. Now we get the truth. She stood up, the exhaustion finally winning the battle for her body. She walked back toward the medical bay, the sounds of the base camp now a symphony of success. She had done her job. She had tracked the signals, followed the patterns, and refused to let the truth be buried. As she lay back down on the bed, she thought one last time about Richard Calloway. He was still out there, but his world was shrinking. The scout would talk, the files would be processed, and the network would be dismantled piece by piece. There was no escape from the math. She closed her eyes, the rhythm of her own breathing finally matching the quiet pulse of the room. She had walked out of the mountains, and in doing so, she had brought the light with her. The hunt wasn't over, but the outcome was now certain. And as sleep finally claimed her, Emily Carter knew that for the first time in a very long time, the shadows were empty. The air in the operations center was thick with the smell of ozone, recycled air, and the stale residue of 100 late-night shifts. It was a space defined by the low, constant hum of server racks and the flickering glow of tactical displays, a world away from the freezing mud and jagged rock of the Montana wilderness. When Emily Carter walked through the heavy reinforced doors, she looked like a ghost that had wandered out of a graveyard and into a boardroom. She was pale, her clothes were a ruin of mountain grit and dried blood, and her movement was stiff, dictated by the heavy bandaging beneath her layers. Yet, as she approached the duty desk, there was a gravity to her that made the room's frantic energy hitch for a heartbeat. The young man behind the console looked up at her, and his eyes widened with that specific, unsettling expression people wore when they saw someone who was supposed to be in a medical bay, someone who should be horizontal and sedated, walking toward them with the focused intensity of a hunting cat. "I need Sergeant Major Willis," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a cutting edge that bypassed the ambient noise of the room. The duty officer blinked, his mouth opening to offer a polite deflection about protocol or medical clearance, but Emily didn't give him the space to breathe. "Right now," she clarified, her gaze never wavering. "He's in a meeting with Colonel Webb, and I need him right now. There is a hostile asset still active in the field. He is not among the 11 in custody. I need Willis before that becomes a larger problem than it already is." The duty officer didn't argue. There was something in Emily's eyes, a terrifying clarity that told him she wasn't guessing. He had his radio in his hand before she had even finished the sentence, his voice urgent as he summoned the command element. Willis arrived in 3 minutes, appearing through the door with Colonel Webb 2 steps behind him. They moved with a synchronized, heavy-footed purpose, their faces grim. Both men stopped a few feet from Emily, looking at her with the focused, unblinking attention of professionals who had learned a hard lesson over the last 12 hours. They had learned that when Emily Carter said something required immediate attention, it was a far safer bet to assume she was right than to waste time proving she was wrong. "The scout," she said, skipping any preamble. "North Gully, 0430 to 0450. He's the one who searched the overhang and reported my status to Calloway. He was not in the withdrawing column. I tracked every figure from the ridge as they moved out. His movement pattern, light, erratic, favoring speed over silence, it doesn't match any of the 12 figures I observed last night or the 11 you've accounted for. He's still in the mountains." Willis's eyes shifted to Webb. The colonel's brow furrowed, his mind already cycling through the logistics of the morning's sweep. "We pulled 11 from the staging area," Webb said, his voice a low rumble. "We assessed the column at 12 based on the preliminary aerial imaging we pulled before the extraction." He paused, the word preliminary hanging in the air like an indictment. Emily nodded, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the tactical map. If the aerial imaging caught the column while he was still separated from it, he wouldn't have been counted in the main element. He'd been operating independently in the south, searching for me. He likely didn't rejoin the main group before they panicked and moved. He knows the terrain, Colonel. He's been operating in that gully system for at least the duration of tonight's operation, which means he was staged there long before the assault initiated. He knows the approach routes, the hides, the withdrawal paths. He could stay out there for days, disappearing into the geography. Or, Webb said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a specific heavy weight, he could be carrying something. The silence that followed was absolute. Emily had already reached that conclusion, but she had kept it tucked away, waiting for the officers to see the same shadow she was chasing. To suggest it was one thing, to have the colonel acknowledge it made it a reality they had to move on. "Calloway knew by 0451 that I was alive and talking," Emily said. That was the moment Morrow's transmission was captured. If Calloway sent that scout back in, it wasn't just to find me. It was a recovery mission. He needed to retrieve something from the staging area before your assets arrived. Something physical. Something that couldn't be trusted to a compromised frequency or a digital burst. Documentation, Willis whispered, the realization hardening his features. Physical records, Emily confirmed. Personnel files, operational logs, the kind of material that a man like Hargrove would have passed physically rather than electronically. He was careful enough to know that every electronic transfer leaves a digital footprint, a ghost in the machine that can be traced back to its source. She took a breath, feeling the pull of the stitches in her side, the kind of material that, if it reaches Calloway, would tell him exactly how much we have, and more importantly, exactly how much we're missing. It would give him the blueprint for his escape. Webb didn't wait for further explanation. He already had his radio out, speaking into it with the flat, rapid-fire cadence of a commander reconfiguring a battlefield in real time. Emily watched as the room shifted around his instructions. The atmosphere changed from the organized chaos of an aftermath to the high-voltage tension of an active pursuit. She caught fragments of the orders. Expand the search grid, focus on the northeastern quadrant, single target, treat as armed and highly operational. The systems in the room seemed to groan as they reoriented toward this new, singular problem. Willis remained standing in front of her, his gaze searching hers. "How did you catch that this morning?" he asked quietly. "I went back through the ridge observation in my head," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion clawing at her. "I counted the column again. Last night the numbers didn't resolve cleanly, but I was tired, I was in pain, and I was accepting the arithmetic that fit the situation. This morning I wasn't." She didn't need to say more. Willis understood the difference between a mind clouded by survival and a mind sharpened by the cold light of day. He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You should be in the medical bay, Carter." "I should be," she agreed, her ghost of a smile not reaching her eyes. "But I'm not." Willis didn't argue. He had apparently learned that arguing with Emily Carter about her own well-being was a spectacular waste of time, a pursuit that yielded no results and only served to irritate both parties. Instead, he pointed toward a chair in the corner of the outer operations room. "Eat something," he commanded, "and stay where I can find you in under 2 minutes." Emily did as she was told. She ate a protein bar that tasted like chalk and drank a cup of coffee that she nursed for the next 3 hours. The coffee was a prop as much as it was a stimulant. Holding the warm ceramic gave her hands something to do and gave her a reason to be in the room. A person with a cup of coffee looked like a person with a purpose, an observer rather than a patient. She sat there, a silent fixture in the corner, listening to the search unfold through the radio traffic. She wasn't officially a party to the comms, but the voices were clear enough in the quiet of the outer room. She tracked the assets as they moved through the northeastern quadrant, her mind projecting their movements onto the mental map she had spent 6 months perfecting. She noted where they searched, where they found nothing, and how they adjusted their sweep. When they deviated from her predicted path, she analyzed the deviation, using it to refine her understanding of what the teams were seeing on the ground. At 13:58, the quality of the radio traffic changed. It wasn't something a casual listener would notice, but to Emily, it was as loud as a siren. It was a shift in the compression of the communication, a move from the rhythmic, searching patterns of a hunt to the tight, urgent bursts of a team that had found its target and was now managing a confrontation. She was already standing, her coffee cup abandoned, when Willis came through the door. His face told her the story before he spoke. "They found him," he said. "North Ridge, about 400 meters east of the staging area. He'd gone to ground in a complex rock formation. Good hide. He knew exactly what he was doing." Willis paused, letting the tension bleed out of his shoulders. He had a messenger bag, physical documents. "Webb's people are going through them now. How much did he get out?" Emily asked, her voice tight. "Did he transmit anything before they closed in?" Willis shook his head. His radio was dead, battery failure. Based on the logs they've recovered, he'd been trying to reach Calloway since approximately 0600 and couldn't get through. There was a brief pause as Willis looked at the floor, then back at her. He was still trying when they found him. Emily absorbed the information, a cold sense of irony settling in her chest. "Calloway burned the frequency," she said. "That's the assessment," Willis replied. "Once Morrow's transmission was flagged as captured, the frequency became a liability. Calloway cut the line, leaving his own man in the dark. That scout spent 7 hours in a rock formation with a bag of secrets he couldn't deliver and a radio that wouldn't talk back. He looked at her steadily, his voice gaining a note of respect. The documents are intact. Chain of custody is established. Webb says it's comprehensive. Personnel files, operational logs, transfer records going back 3 years. It's everything Hargrove passed physically over the entire duration of their relationship. Emily leaned back against the wall, her mind flying to Hargrove, currently sitting in administrative detention. He was likely at this very moment calculating whether his cooperation was a viable strategy, weighing his options like the career bureaucrat he was. With those documents in hand, his calculations had just become infinitely more complicated. "Hargrove will talk now," she said. Willis nodded. "Webb thinks so too." She sat back down, not because she wanted to, but because her body finally registered the news as permission to let go. A wave of physical exhaustion crashed over her, more intense than anything she had felt on the mountain. It was the sudden release of a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. Willis noticed. He always noticed things in that quiet, undemonstrative way that made her trust him more than almost anyone else in the service. "Carter," he said, his voice unusually soft, "the case is built. Webb has the files, the documents, the captured transmission, and 11 personnel in custody who are all looking for a deal. And Hargrove is going to talk. You have done." He searched for the right word, something accurate without being hyperbolic. "You've done more than your share of the work on this. Calloway is still out there," she reminded him. "Calloway is running," Willis countered. "And he is running with significantly fewer resources than he woke up with yesterday. The network he's been meticulously operating for 4 years just collapsed at both ends simultaneously. He has no eyes, no ears, and nowhere to go that we aren't already looking. He will be found." Emily knew he was right. She also knew the agonizing distance between "will be found" and "has been found." She had lived in that gap all through the previous night, understanding its terrifying dimensions intimately. But as she sat there in the dim light of the operations center, she felt a shift in her own perspective. She had done what she was positioned to do. She had used every scrap of her training, every ounce of her stubbornness, and every bit of her specialized knowledge to bring the truth to light. The rest of it, the international manhunt, the legal proceedings, the massive machinery of the state, was beyond her. She had never been good at accepting limits, but she realized now that some limits were real, and knowing which ones to respect was a form of intelligence all its own. She finished her cold coffee and set the cup down with a definitive click. "All right," she said. The formal tribunal convened 6 days later. In the time between the mountain and the courtroom, the landscape of the investigation had shifted under the weight of the evidence Emily had provided. Hargrove had broken on the second day of his interrogation. It hadn't been a dramatic collapse, filled with tears or grand proclamations of guilt. Instead, he had broken the way careful, methodical men break, when they realize that the math no longer supports their position. Once he understood that the backup server existed and the physical documents had been recovered, he pivoted to cooperation with the same clinical efficiency he had used to betray his country. He gave Webb everything: names, dates, transfer records, and the specific communication protocols he had used to funnel Emily's intelligence summaries to Calloway for 4 long years. Perhaps most chillingly, he confirmed that Emily herself had been flagged as a direct threat to the network 14 weeks ago. That was precisely when her 6th signal event had documented a pattern, so precise it moved from circumstantial to actionable. They had been watching her for 3 months, assessing her, waiting for the right moment to eliminate her. They didn't want a messy assassination. They wanted the environment to do the work. They wanted the chaos of combat to provide a shroud of plausible deniability. The ambush, the retreat, the abandonment, it had all been designed to ensure her death was a tragic footnote of war rather than a deliberate execution. It was sophisticated, Emily admitted to herself, but it had failed. And the satisfaction she took in that failure was cold and absolute. Morrow, on the other hand, did not break cleanly. He was a man of smaller character, and his collapse happened in agonizing pieces over several days. Each admission was dragged out of him only when the evidence became so overwhelming he could no longer deny it. He admitted to the abandonment, then to the false report, then to the final transmission. But he spent 4 days insisting that the abandonment had been a split-second field decision made under pressure. It wasn't until the 5th day, when Webb showed him the documents recovered from the scout's messenger bag, that the final wall came down. Emily wasn't in the room for that moment, but Willis told her about it later. Morrow had looked at the files that detailed his own recruitment and payment schedule, and had gone silent for 40 minutes. When he finally spoke, he provided a full accounting of his 22 months of service to Callaway. 22 months. Emily had only been with the unit for 14. It meant Morrow had been working against the unit's integrity long before she arrived. He had spent over a year assessing her, watching her work, and eventually deciding under Callaway's direction that she had to be silenced. She sat with that realization for a long time. She didn't feel the sharp, white-hot anger she had felt on the mountain. That anger had been a tool, and she had set it down once its work was done. Instead, she felt a heavy, complicated sense of significance. She had been dangerous enough to warrant a planned execution. An 18-year-old with a backup server and a sharp ear had represented a structural threat to a multi-year intelligence network. Underneath the bone-deep weariness, she felt something that wasn't quite pride, but was built from the same sturdy materials. The tribunal itself was a quiet, sterile affair. There were no cameras, no emotional outbursts, no cinematic moments of revelation. It was a long, methodical march through the facts. Emily gave her testimony over 2 sessions that lasted a combined 7 hours. She spoke with the same precision she used in her reports, delivering every detail of the signal events, the cadence analysis, and the events on the mountain. Not once was the substance of her testimony challenged. The panel members, 4 high-ranking officers with decades of experience, focused their questions on her methodology. They were skeptical of her age and the complexity of the system she had built. Emily met their skepticism with the patience of a teacher, explaining the technical nuances of her work until the most skeptical member of the panel was the one taking the most notes. Webb sat in on both sessions, a silent, stabilizing presence at the end of the long conference table. At one point, when a panel member questioned the reliability of the cadence analysis for the 11th time, Webb had simply set his pen down and looked the man in the eye. The acoustic analysis team independently verified Carter's identification of the event, he said, his voice flat and indisputable. The margin of error was less than 2%. I recommend we move on. They moved on immediately. On the 7th day after the tribunal concluded, the news came. Richard Callaway had been detained at a border crossing in northern Idaho. He had been moving under a sophisticated alias, driving a vehicle registered to a shell corporation, and carrying identification that had already passed 3 checkpoints. He was caught at the 4th because an analyst in Virginia, using the cadence patterns Emily had documented, had flagged a voice transmission from a motel phone 48 hours earlier. They hadn't found him by chance. They had predicted his movements based on the very data he had tried so hard to destroy. Willis brought the news to the medical bay, where Emily was finally, voluntarily, allowing Yates to inspect her wounds. He stood in the doorway and said it simply, "They have Callaway." Emily set down the book she had been pretending to read, her breath hitching. "Idaho," Willis added, "border crossing 40 minutes ago." Emily breathed out a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry the last remnants of the mountain's cold with it. "The cadence analysis," she whispered. "Webb used it. The voice identification unit used your methodology," Willis confirmed. "They cross-referenced it with a recording from 8 years ago. They had a 48-hour lead on his location and were waiting for him at the border." Emily looked up at the sterile white ceiling of the infirmary. She thought about a forgettable briefing room months ago, about a signal event she had labeled as number 1 before she knew what it would become. She had kept track when no one else would. She had built a fortress of data out of thin air and static. "Willis," she asked, "was anyone hurt at Miller's Crossing, 1st Platoon, when they established the defensive positions?" Willis paused, checking a mental record. 2 personnel with non-critical injuries during the setup. No fatalities. The assault was broken before it could even begin. Emily closed her eyes, holding that thought. No fatalities. A crossing held. 11 in custody. Physical documents recovered. Hargrove and Morrow talking. Callaway in a cell in Idaho. And 6 months of work that had lived on a hidden server protected by nothing but her own foresight was now a permanent part of the official record. Yates moved toward her to start the inspection, stopping briefly to look at Emily's face. "Good news?" the medic asked softly. "Callaway's in custody," Emily replied. Yates set her medical kit on the table with a deliberate, thoughtful motion. Then she said, "Patricia Odom called this morning. She'd heard rumors. Apparently, retired intelligence officers have a very long reach. She wanted to know how you were. Emily looked at her, surprised. What did you tell her? I told her you'd walked out of a Montana mountain with a bullet wound, rebuilt a broken radio, stopped an assault on a bridge, and dismantled a 4-year spy network. Yates said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I delivered the information in that order because I thought she'd appreciate the sequence. And Emily asked, "What did she say?" She said, and I am quoting here, of course she did. "Then she told me to tell you to get some rest." Emily laughed. It was a short, rough sound, unexpected and real. It pulled at the stitches in her side, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't care about the pain. "Tell her I'm working on it," she said. 3 weeks later, Emily Carter stood at the perimeter fence of the mountain reconnaissance base, watching the sun begin its slow climb over the eastern ridges. The formal recognition had happened the day before, a quiet ceremony in a room filled with people who spoke in calibrated, precise tones about her exceptional service. Medals were given, hands were shaken, and Webb had offered her a 2-word commendation that she knew was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Willis had said even less, but the look in his eyes had told her that he understood the weight of everything she had endured. It was enough. She stood there now, listening to the mountain. There would be a new assignment soon. There was always a new assignment, and the work would reset to 0. She would have to build it all again, the observations, the patterns, the careful documentation of the world's hidden rhythms. But she didn't mind the reset. She had always found the beginning of things to be the most interesting part. She heard the wind moving through the high pines, a specific low-frequency whistle that spoke of the temperature differential between the peaks and the valley. She heard the distant rush of a creek she had only ever seen on a map. She heard a supply truck miles away, its engine note consistent with a heavy load. Normal sounds, morning sounds. The mountain was returning to its natural state, no longer a battlefield, just a landscape. She thought about Morrow, who would spend the rest of his life answering for 6 words spoken in a muddy gully. She thought about Hargrove, whose decades of careful filtering had been undone by a girl he had dismissed as overconfident. And she thought about the scout, sitting in his rock hide with his dead radio, a perfect symbol of what happens when you build a system on the assumption that a single person can be silenced. Her silence had never been guaranteed. Anyone who had truly looked at her file would have known that. The morning moved around her, ordinary and undramatic, and Emily Carter listened to all of it with the unhurried attention of a woman who knew that paying attention was the most consequential choice a person could make. It was a choice to notice, to document, and to trust what you heard over what you were told. She had been left for dead by men who called her a liability, and she had walked out of those mountains with the evidence that destroyed them. There was nothing lucky about it. Every step, every decision, every signal event was a testament to the power of simply refusing to look away. She was 18 years old, she had a healed wound and a permanent record of excellence, and she had the extraordinary, undiminished capacity to hear the things that others could not. She turned from the fence and began the walk back toward the operations center. The world was full of patterns, and she was just getting started.